It strikes me as profoundly unprincipled because the Supreme Court has long said that decisions of great durability on the basis of which people have reshaped their lives should not be overruled in the absence of some extraordinary change other than the mere personnel of the court. Nothing has happened other than essentially the Trump packing of the court, the addition of 3 justices selected by Donald Trump. Nothing has changed since Roe v. Wade and Casey to justify suddenly and for the first time in the court's history taking away a fundamental personal right. Now, I say it's unprincipled, and I think I would feel that way even if I were strongly pro-choice, because this decision does not simply overturn the right to abortion. It overturns people's control over their own bodies. In the Casey decision in 1992, in a very much overlooked passage, the court said that if we tell women that we can force them to remain pregnant, then it follows we might be able to force some women to have abortions. If, for example, for eugenic reasons, we think that the babies to whom they will give birth are not going to live very long or will live severely crippled lives, or if we think they made an unwise decision in becoming pregnant at a very young age and their parents want them to abort, we can force abortions on them. I wrote an article in The Atlantic just a few weeks ago saying, don't be mistaken. Don't think just because you might be pro-choice and anti-abortion that this decision is definitely going to protect your freedom. This decision takes power away from people over their own bodies and lives and intimate choices and gives that power to government. That's the basic thing it does. And the principle of an anti-tyrannical constitution, that principle is one that is now being shaken by the Supreme Court without any real justification. That's why I call it unprincipled.
If I can ask it this way, what went wrong? It's been on the books for almost 50 years now, Roe versus Wade has. And with other major changes in constitutional law, such as, for example, Brown versus Board of Education, I dare say the country came toward the decision, even if it wasn't there at the beginning. The country didn't come toward this decision. We seem as divided today as we were then. What went wrong?
Well, I think Democrats were not as effective at the political game as Republicans were. They've played a long game, half a century long, gradually putting on the courts people who were committed to a certain view on particular substantive issues: guns, abortion, school prayer, a number of substantive issues. And gradually they did it. And those of us who kept telling Democrats in our own party, you've got to put more emphasis on the importance of electing people who share your constitutional values and will not confirm justices to the Supreme Court who have a completely different view of the Constitution. People didn't listen. We didn't work as hard as the other side did. And, you know, it's a cliche that elections have consequences, but they do. And it was the election of 2016 more than anything else that had this consequence. Because when Trump was elected, he told everybody what he's going to do. He was going to put justices on the court who would, he was confident, vote to overrule Roe v. Wade. He did exactly that. And it was the election of Donald Trump that did this. You know, we could go back and find other causes, but this is a direct political consequence. And it's a consequence that really represents the tyranny of the minority, because it is a minority of the people who elected Donald Trump. The justices who made this difference, the 3, were all confirmed by a group of senators who were elected by a dramatic minority of the American people. The maldistribution of votes in the Senate is part of the sort of hardwired into our system. But when you add it all up, this is the consequence of a purely political shift, not a shift in understanding of basic rights or anything of the sort.
Professor, you are, of course, a scholar, but you're also, you've spent a career as a strategist, if I can put it that way, of the Supreme Court and doing oral arguments, planning oral arguments. We now have a concurring opinion from Justice Thomas talking about substantive due process rights going well beyond abortion, involving things like contraception, things like same-sex marriage. If you were planning the defense of those, despite the way that this decision came out, what would you do?
Well, I would perhaps consider a different career. But being serious, I think we have to make political changes. I don't think there is any path in the current court. I think Thomas was admirably candid, more so than Alito. Alito pretends that those other rights, like the right to contraception, the right to same-sex marriage, the right to personal intimacy with the person of your choice in the privacy of your home, he pretends that those are not on the chopping block. Well, they are. And Thomas made it very explicit. He's basically inviting challenges. The court cannot prevent the elimination of a fundamental pillar of its jurisprudence from having fallout consequences. And those fallout consequences are very serious, and they can be changed only at the ballot box. If we get a Congress and a Senate that is willing, for example, to consider expanding the court by adding 4 seats, that's a possibility. Even short of that, Congress could pass, if we had a very different Senate, Congress could pass a national codification of the right of personal reproductive choice. The House has already passed such a bill. The current Senate wouldn't even consider debating it. But if we are serious, as the president just said a few minutes ago, that Roe is on the ballot this November, that's where I would put my energy. I would not put my energy at clever brief writing, because that's not going to make the key difference.
Professor, finally, you, I know, have real respect for the institution of the Supreme Court, as do I. What does this do potentially to the institution itself? And we talk about stare decisis, not because we just want people to stay with what they've said in the past, but also, as I understand it, it's cabined the extraordinary powers of this non-elected branch of government. Are we substantially undermining stare decisis with this decision?
I think without any doubt. The justices talk a good game when they say that we believe in the power of precedent, but when push comes to shove and the rubber hits the road, precedent takes the hindmost. It seems to me that the latest poll, which showed that the court's respect as an institution has fallen to 25%, the lowest in American history, I bet after today it'll be dropping to 15%. I think that's a shame, because I think although the court throughout the course of our history has had more power than I think it's appropriate for an anti-majoritarian body to have, and apart from the brief period of the Warren court, the court really hasn't protected voting rights or minorities in the way that the myth would have it. Nonetheless, it's important to have an institution that can stand up against tyranny in a way that this court can. And when that institution itself loses respect because it is so obviously being driven by a change in personnel, then I think the country is in danger. And that danger is compounded by the kind of danger we saw in the nearly successful coup and the insurrection of January 6th. So the country is really at the cliff's edge with all of its institutions in a very fragile condition.
Okay, Professor, thank you so much. Really a treat to have you with us today. That is Lawrence Tribe. He's professor of constitutional law at Harvard. Coming up, Doug Heye, former communications director of the Republican National Committee, weighs in on this important decision. This is a special edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.
To today's Options Insight, sponsored by Thinkorswim, by TD Ameritrade.
institution I know of wants you to serve on their board, and you're very involved in the art world. What is it about art that attracts you?
Well, art is essential in a democracy, David. Art is so important. We know what art does to young people. We know that exposure to art brings about higher levels of empathy. It helps people understand how other cultures, other people live, and it just brings out the kind of humanity in all of us. There are times when I have observed leaders use language that is inhumane while talking about other human beings, while talking about the world. And I think to myself, this person has clearly never engaged in beautiful poetry. They've never listened to the words of a great playwright. They've never sat and reflected on a beautiful painting or picture. Because if they had been really educated, had they really been exposed to the arts, they wouldn't find it possible to use this kind of language.
Front Row, exclusive interviews with the most influential figures in finance. Lloyd Blankfein.
Deflation is a terrible thing. Inflation you could tolerate.
Kathy Wood.
Tesla will be in the pole position to dominate.
Jeremy Grantham.
We've had a very, very abnormal honeymoon Goldilocks period.
First available on the Bloomberg Terminal, then on Bloomberg Television and Bloomberg.com. Front Row, the best seats in the house for business's greatest minds.
This is a market that, over the past few weeks, has made it clear it wants to go higher. It got a little spooked by the idea that geopolitical tensions are rising.
BSO Now is your online home for weekly Boston Symphony Orchestra and Boston Pops performances. See new concerts that go behind the scenes, plus acclaimed archival concerts. Visit bso.org/now, where the music plays on. BSO season sponsor, Bank of America.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David West, and we have special coverage for 2 hours today of that new decision for the Supreme Court out this morning, overturning Roe against Wade, with a lot of consequences for a lot of people, for the economy, for women, and yes, for politics as well. To give us a sense from the Republican point of view, we welcome now Doug Heye. He's a Republican strategist and former RNC communications director. Mr. Heye also served as deputy chief of staff for Eric Cantor, when Mr. Cantor was the House Majority Leader. So welcome. It's great to have you here, Doug. We heard earlier from the current minority leader, Kevin McCarthy, with his initial take on what this meant for Republicans. He seems to think it means something pretty good. What do you think?
Yeah, for most Republicans, it means delivering on a promise that has been long held. You know, I used to work in the Senate for Senator Richard Burr, and when I did, he met with then nominee Roberts, then nominee Alito, and when we were going through that process, I wouldn't have told you in 2005, 2006, that that's what we would experience, you know, so many years later. This is the culmination for Republicans of what they've campaigned on. And I think if we do political winners and losers here, after 2 weeks of Donald Trump, frankly, getting his head kicked in by the January 6th committee, he's now able to go to his base and say, I've delivered for you. And that'll be a big message for him if he decides to, you know, run or not run or whatever he decides to do. It cements a big part of his legacy.
Is it going to make any difference really in the midterms?
It will in some ways, but I would tell you, beware people on television saying that whatever happens in politics is great news for their side. It is wishful thinking with sometimes the intellectual honesty of a professional wrestling referee. What we know is that this is going to be an important issue to a lot of voters, but we don't know how much it really ranks on the issues of what they're looking at. So when we talk about moving from banning abortion in theory to in practice, what does that do 4 months from now as people are still paying crazy bills for gas, food, everything that they're spending money on, and where do they rank those issues? So what I'd do is I'd look at specific races where you might have an impact. I'd start in Missouri with the Senate primary, where Eric Greitens was just endorsed by Right to Life, but Eric Schmidt, the Attorney General in Missouri, has already put out a picture of him signing in the trigger laws now. So he's basically saying, well, you might have gotten the endorsement. I'm actually getting things done. So that'll have an important hold on that Senate race. I'd look at governor's races as well, Pennsylvania and Georgia being a good example. In the Pennsylvania Senate race, John Fetterman was out with a statement. You know, we haven't seen him in a long time, but he put a statement out immediately.
Doug, one of the questions I always have when something this dramatic happens is, what's the danger of overplaying it? From either side, I could say. Republicans going too far and perhaps alienating, for example, suburban women. On the other hand, maybe Democrats going too far and maybe alienating particularly some of the Latino population.
Yeah, overreach is always a problem in politics, or a potential problem to be concerned of. I think it's one of the reasons potentially that Mitch McConnell was so keen on getting the gun deal done. And he had said, we have a problem with suburban voters. This is one way that they can go and address this, especially with today's news. But clearly, there's going to be a lot of money raised on this. There's going to be a lot of voter enthusiasm that's impacted by this. What we don't know is Democrats will be more excited, Republicans will be more excited, at least some, and what impact that has. But as these laws are being enacted in state after state, there is a real risk of political backlash, especially as we're now talking about, things like the Obergefell decision and Griswold, of where real issues of privacy, further can be drawn into this.
Yeah, which takes us to the Clarence Thomas, the concurring opinion. Thank you so much, Doug. It's really always a treat to have you with us. That's Doug Heye. He's Republican strategist and former RNC communications director. Coming up, we're going to have some more coverage of that Supreme Court decision. This is a special edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.
When the market feels toppy, investors may want to switch to low PE stocks with rising earnings. They're hard to find in the US, but not in many other markets. But you can't compare and buy stocks trading in different currencies, right? You can now, with Interactive Brokers Global Analyst.
Interactive Brokers. Invest globally in stocks, options, futures, currencies, bonds, and funds from a single integrated platform.
Reduce carbon emissions, they say. When it comes to our planet, we need to do more. We choose positivity. We choose to change. Tomorrow now.
Stories about what they call black soot, caused by the manufacturing and consumption of these fuel products in the illegal refineries.
Oil theft, known as bunkering, and the refining of its spoils is worsening the damage from decades of fossil fuel exploitation, creating one of the world's most severe ecological disasters.
Our sacred forests, our homes have to give way to oil wells, and no one gets much benefit.
Imagine a resident of Port Harcourt who inhales this soot every second in 24 hours, 7 days a week, 30 days in the month, and for years now. We are dying slowly but surely, and our lifespan is reducing every day.
You will shed light on dark matter. You will make aging optional. Because when you subscribe to Bloomberg, you won't just get news. You will get insight into limitless possibilities. Before you change the world, Bloomberg.
I think that it's hard to put your head around any narrative. Let's just be honest. We've had sort of a shift in, are we in some sort of stagflation fears moment? People were talking about that all day yesterday.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David West, and we're just wrapping up 2 hours of special coverage of that Supreme Court decision from this morning, 10 o'clock Eastern Time, overturning Roe versus Wade. And to wrap it up with us, we go once again to our Washington correspondent, Joe Matthew, up at the Supreme Court. He, of course, is the host of Sound On. He's outside the Supreme Court right now. I hope by 5 p.m. this evening you're going to be back in the radio studio with your program, Joe. So tell us what's going on right now at the Supreme Court.
Yeah. It's getting pretty loud again, I have to admit, David. We saw a little bit of a lull in the crowd for a while there after they had been demonstrating on both sides for the better part of a couple of hours. But AOC showed up. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was here at a rally pro-choice supporters a short time ago, and people really keyed off of that. Just as that was happening, a couple more busloads of Capitol Police showed up. Just off the camera to the side here, there is a very large group of them, all wearing reflector vests. It looks like there are almost as many police as protesters from this angle, to be honest, and they're staying off to the side, presumably in case any kind of aggressive activity breaks out here. There are police as well scattered throughout the crowd, but we now have a very large number of officers just off to the side here on the lawn between the Supreme Court and the U.S. Capitol. This could be a long day. We have no idea how long these protesters are going to be there, David, reminding everyone that hundreds were there even before the ruling was announced this morning at 10 a.m. Washington time.
So, Joel, let me ask you, have you seen any arrests at this point? Because what the pictures we're seeing right now look pretty peaceful.
It has been peaceful. It's important to note that. Things get loud. There's been screaming. There's been some crying. There's been laughing and singing. But people have responded to the police fairly well. Every moment I have seen a police officer try to take someone off a bench, off a wall, tell them to calm down, they've actually been accommodating, and hopefully it stays that way. There are concerns about what happens after nightfall tonight, David, and I suspect that's why police are beginning to gather here in the second half of the day.
Joe, we've had a lot of drama today, and you've really covered it magnificently, I must say. You got a long way to go. We're going to have a lot of follow-on in the coming days, weeks, and months, I dare say. At the same time, to remind us, there's one story that is still out there we don't know the end to, and that's the investigation of the leak. It turns out that leaked opinion was basically the opinion we got, so it was right.
That is correct, and it's still unknown even if this was a clerk, if it came from a liberal or a conservative justice. The court has been remarkably tight about this, quiet about this, keeping leaks from getting into the mainstream media here. And look, David, you spent time in this organization. This is a very tightly knit group. After that leak, they circled the wagons, and they are trying to take care of this with the direction of the marshal on their own here. And at some point, presumably, the Chief Justice will tell us what they found. But that is absolutely right. As justices, in many cases, hunker down in their homes with their families with federal protection here in the District of Columbia, in Virginia, and Maryland, there is a very important investigation happening inside that building.
Joe, I can't thank you enough for all your great work through these last 2 hours. That's Bloomberg's Joe Matthew, host of Sound On. You want to listen to that at 5 p.m. this afternoon. And this is Bloomberg with special coverage of the Supreme Court.
Accelerating into a digitized and decentralized future.
That is why Bitcoin is here.
The cryptocurrency market has roughly a $3 trillion market cap. That's a huge milestone.
This is the largest, fastest wealth creation event in the history of the world. And financial institutions have only now just figured this out.
It is a power to the people kind of technology.
However, we are still tied to the centralized banking system in a way that is unnecessary.
The crypto sector today.
updates, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, the Bloomberg Business app, and at Bloomberg Quick Take. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. U.S. stocks solidly in the green. We are off session highs, but the Dow, the S&P, and NASDAQ are all advancing. A rally in treasuries waned after a reading on inflation expectations eased, and the Federal Reserve's Jim Bullard suggested recession fears are overdone. The S&P 500 index up just about 2.3% right now, putting it on track to snap a 3-week decline. Sentiment improved further after the University of Michigan's gauge of longer-term consumer inflation expectations settled back from an initially reported 14-year high. So the S&P up 88, up 2.3%. The Dow up 637, up 2.1%. NASDAQ up 261, a gain of 2.3%. 10 years down 10/30 seconds. 10-year yield 3.12%. Spot gold up $4.50 the ounce to $18.27, up 0.3%. West Texas Intermediate crude 106.81 a barrel, up right now by 2.4%. Passengers are facing higher airfares and canceled flights. One of the issues is a shortage of pilots. Helene Becker is with Cowen. She says it is not just a pilot shortage.
People don't realize that the U.S. hasn't trained any air traffic controllers for 2 years. They're on the hunt now to find more. I think I looked at the numbers yesterday, and we saw something like 4,000 air traffic controllers are needed. It takes 4 years to train an air traffic controller, and then another 2 years for experience.
Airline stocks are flying higher today. UAL, United, up 6.1%. American, up 6.4%. And so those are some of the airline stocks that are advancing. We've got the S&P up 91 points now, higher by 2.4%. 10-year yield 3.12%. And that's a Bloomberg Business Flash.
This is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine. Plus, global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Bloomberg Quick Takes Tim Stenovic on Bloomberg Radio.
Live from the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio in New York. Good afternoon to our audience worldwide on radio and on YouTube. It's Bloomberg Business Week on Friday, June 24th, 2022. I'm Tim Stenovic. Carol Masser still out, but joining me this afternoon is Bloomberg Surveillance and Markets anchor Paul Sweeney. Paul, good to have you.
Great to be here.
Did you get lunch?
We got lunch.
You did like all morning radio.
We did morning radio. Then we let David Weston take it for a couple hours, but we're back.
All right, we're back, and we're really pleased to have you. Hey, a really important day, a historic day for the United States. Roe v. Wade overturned by the Supreme Court in a 6-3 decision, wiping out the constitutional right to an abortion. The court voting along ideological lines. Already, J.P. Morgan, Disney, Comcast, and more are saying that they will pay for employees to travel to another state if needed to obtain a legal abortion. We've got a great lineup of legal experts, journalists, a columnist, and more, all weighing in this afternoon. And of course, Paul, we are focused on the markets, stocks surging after we got a bit of a read on Americans' inflation expectations, and they've eased just a bit.
Yeah, it's absolutely. We have the S&P up 2.3%. I'm looking at this headline that crossed earlier today on the Bloomberg terminal. Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis President James Bullard, he says that U.S. recession fears are overblown. He thinks consumers are healthy, so I think that's partially pushing these markets higher.
Well, speaking of inflation, Nobel laureate economist and New York Times columnist, Interactive Brokers studio is Abigail Doolittle, markets reporter for Bloomberg News. Also joining us this afternoon, Kriti Gupta, markets correspondent for Bloomberg. She joins us on the phone. Abigail, I want to start with you. Take us into this trade because we are seeing quite a bit of green on the screen.
Yes, indeed. It's a pretty bullish day, and it's a bullish week. We have the S&P 500 right now up 2.4%, the NASDAQ up about the same amount. The banks outperforming up 4.2%. That could have something to do with yields up a little bit, but of course we have those Fed stress tests, which the banks passed. I think that
Congratulations, banks.
Congratulations,
they
banks.
aced the test.
Yes.
Good job, banks.
Yes, good job, and especially Morgan Stanley apparently, and that stock, actually it's up about equal to Goldman Sachs. Both are up about 5%, so big gains remains there. But we have a weekly gain, the first one in 4 weeks. And I think that what we're looking at here, or something that I'm watching at least, is since the FOMC meeting last week when Fed Chair Jay Powell, they obviously raised rates by 75 bips, but he also walked it back in a way by saying, don't get used to this. We'll be hiking, but don't get used to this degree necessarily. That was when you saw the big rally that day. It moderated, but since that time period, we're up, a couple percent. This week, we're up 6%. So I think it tells you that investors like what the Fed's doing. It's sort of like a Goldilocks tightening cycle.
Kriti Gupta, I want to bring you in here. I mean, I'm looking across the market here. I'm wondering, is this just kind of a dead cat bounce within the context of a greater bear market? Or is there something more to read into this?
Well, I'm going to start with the first part that you said, the dead cat bounce, because I think if you look at this on a weekly basis, as Abigail was pointing out, this is your first positive week. And I think about after 3 weeks of declines, it's not just the stock market. I mean, these 2.4% gains on the S&P 500 are pretty wild in the context. But if you actually look at this cross asset, you see this kind of reversal happening in the market. So whatever the trend has been for the last month or so, this week seemed to reverse it. So the trend for the stock market was it was dropping for 3 weeks straight. This week was a positive week. It's the same story for bond yield. It's also the same story for the dollar. So to your point, Paul, I really do wonder how much of this is actually sustainable from a fundamental basis. I would completely agree with Abigail that it does look like Chairman Powell and what the Fed came out and said does seem to have some sort of weighting, especially with the consumer sentiment numbers out this morning. But I also wonder how much of this is really going to last, because there is still that wall of worry. The recession odds, or calls, I should say, are actually getting higher and higher and closer, as opposed to the other way around. So at least today, for today's equity action, it does seem really just like a brief reversal, especially in a very light volume period.
Abigail, I want to follow up on what Kriti was saying with Americans' inflation expectations easing from that 14-year high just a few weeks ago. And we heard Fed Chair Powell cite these University of Michigan numbers last week in his statement as part of the justification for hiking by 75 basis points. How much of today's rally is about that?
It's hard to say. I mean, when I look at these numbers, they came in a little bit by about 0.2%. So,
but it's something. It's something.
That's exactly it. It's something. And so the dip buyers are going to use anything that they can to buy. It's interesting what Kriti was just saying in terms of thinking that this probably doesn't have that far to go. I agree that this is a bear market rally. There may be a little bit of reason, though, to think that this is going to be a longer one than the last one. In May, I think it was basically a 1-week deal. In March, it was a 2-week deal. I actually wouldn't be surprised if this goes just a little bit longer. The only thing that can rock the boat, well, I shouldn't say the only thing, because there's so many different factors. But at the end of the day, it's the Fed and the tightening and how much do they accept it. But we also have earnings coming up. But I think that there could be reason. I mean, you guys probably remember, especially you, Paul, in 2008, there was a period of time, I think it was April through July, or there was a multi-month period in there where it felt like, all right, maybe, January and February, we can get past that. I wouldn't be surprised if we see something like that here.
Yeah, it's interesting. And Kriti, also, when I take a look at the VIX, and I'll call out the VIX in honor of Tom Keene, who I assume is enjoying a beverage of his choice as we speak here. But the VIX is down, 2 full sticks here, just above 27. The market feels a little bit better from that perspective. But, I guess we've had so much volatility year to date.
There is, and I think it's fair to say that actually, even if you look at simply what the VIX has been doing compared to its last peak, I would say in May, about May 9th, I'm looking at the chart here, had a 34 handle. It was kind of the post-war norm of a 30 VIX. And then as recently as June 13th, which was the peak after that, you saw, once again, a 34 handle. But if you look at the intraday volatility, or at least the volatility of the VIX, which gets a little nerdy here, that's really where you start to see it perhaps come down a little bit. So to Abby's point, I think that there is an argument here that perhaps some of these gains can sustain. Does that mean the volatility is going to go away? Not necessarily, but there is some room for a little bit of improvement.
Okay, Abigail, in 15 seconds left, I'm doing a little math here, so it might be wrong, but I'm showing that we're only down 19% from the January high on the S&P 500. So if that means we close out of 20%, does that mean we're out of a bear market?
That's an interesting question. So technically, one could make that case, but I think that if you talk to most strategists, and I think maybe Kriti would agree with this as well as a markets journalist, no, the bear market is still on, and especially if you look at the sector composition on the year and just the tone, it's going to be much more convincing. But I wouldn't be surprised if there's market action in the weeks ahead that is convincing enough that's going to people are going to question it. It's going to be a really tough call in a couple of weeks.
All right, Abigail Doolittle and Kriti Gupta live with us. Let's go to Washington, D.C. now for the latest on world and national news with Nancy Lyons. Hey, Nance.
Thanks, Tim. The Supreme Court has ended constitutional protections for abortion that had been in place nearly 50 years. It was a decision by its conservative majority to overturn the court's landmark abortion cases. President Biden calls it a sad day.
The conservative majority of the Supreme Court shows how extreme it is, how far removed they are from the majority of this country. They've made the United States an outlier among developed nations in the world. But this decision must not be the final word.
Biden says it'll be up to voters now to elect leaders who share their views. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi says Congress will act to overcome what she calls the court's extremism. She says women today now have fewer rights than their mothers.
Today, the Republican-controlled Supreme Court has achieved their dark, extreme goal of ripping away a woman's right to make their own reproductive health decisions.
Pelosi calls today's decision outrageous and heart-wrenching. House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy is applauding today's decision.
This great nation can now live up to its core principle that all are created equal, not born equal, created equal. Americans celebrate this historic victory because we know it will save the lives of millions of children and it will give families hope.
McCarthy says today's decision also shows the Supreme Court will not be bullied. Also, the House passed and is sending to President Biden the most wide-ranging gun violence bill Congress has passed in decades. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts.
Thank you so much for that update, Nancy Lyons. Tim Stenovic and Paul Sweeney were live in the Bloomberg Interactive Broker studio here in New York. So, Paul, when the draft opinion leaked a few weeks ago, we started to hear from companies about what they would do in the case of an overturned Roe v. Wade. We got that Supreme Court decision today, and we're getting some more details on that. As I mentioned at the top, we've heard from companies like J.P. Morgan who've come out and said they're going to pay for travel across state lines. The question I think that a lot of people have is whether or not that would still be illegal now that Roe v. Wade has been overturned. Well, Greg Storr weighing in on this, saying that Justice Brett Kavanaugh, who emerged Friday as the Supreme Court's pivotal vote on abortion, said states outlawing the procedure may not bar residents from traveling to other states to terminate their pregnancies.
Yeah, and that's a little bit of a clarification, but I'm just not sure, and I think a lot of folks are just unsure how binding that is. I'm just looking at his quote here from Justice Kavanaugh, quote, "In my view, the answer is no based upon the constitutional right to interstate travel." So not explicitly laid out there, but that's his opinion. But that certainly just opens the door, and I think what we've heard from a lot of people today is just this opinion just opens the door for so many other questions about abortion per se than just about other personal liberties that have been enacted over the last 100+ years.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. A lot of questions this afternoon about what this means for gay marriage, what it means for actually being allowed to be in a same-sex relationship beyond getting married.
Yeah, Noah Feldman, Bloomberg Opinion Columns, has a fantastic column out on that this afternoon on the terminal and I think on Bloomberg.com. So I recommend people go to that because it just kind of goes to the issue of all the Pandora's box being open, if you will, that this ruling really brings to the fore. So it's something that the court can perhaps look at.
Well, senior reporter here, Matthew Boyle, he covers management and workplace here at Bloomberg News. He sent a tweet out earlier that I retweeted. It was really interesting. He said, "To all the CEOs saying they'll cover travel expenses for employees seeking reproductive care out of state, how will you allow employees to maintain confidentiality? Will employees have to disclose to HR that they're looking for an abortion?" So some really interesting questions there. And the story will, of course, continue, as will our coverage. This is Bloomberg.
updates, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, the Bloomberg Business app, and at Bloomberg Quick Take. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. We've got the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ solidly in the green. We're off session highs, but stocks are looking at the best week in a month as sentiment calms. The S&P now higher by 90 points, up 2.4%. The Dow's up 638, higher by 2.1%. The NASDAQ Composite Index is up 270 points, up right now by 2.4%. 10 years down 8/30 seconds, 10-year yield 3.11%. Spot gold up 0.4%, 18.30 the ounce, while West Texas Intermediate crude oil is up 2.7%, 107.11 for a barrel of WTI. Bitcoin now higher by 1%, 20,995 on Bitcoin. After earnings, FedEx shares surging now by 7%. Recapping, S&P up 90, a gain of 2.4%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Thank you so much for that update, Charlie Pellet. Well, he's a Nobel laureate, a columnist for the New York Times, and the distinguished professor of economics at the City University of New York Graduate Center. Also the author or editor of more than 24 books, including The Return of Depression Economics and Arguing with Zombies, among others. Paul Krugman, welcome back to Bloomberg Business Week Radio. It's great to have you with us. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
We're doing okay. I want to start with the Supreme Court decision. I saw you were tweeting about it. We learned today, of course, that the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, wiping out the constitutional right to an abortion. Now, we've already seen companies like J.P. Morgan and others come out today and say that they're going to pay for employees to travel to other states if needed to obtain a legal abortion. I'm wondering about the economic effects of this. Do you see any ripple effect in the U.S. economy as a result of this decision?
Well, probably not in terms of the macro numbers. I think there may be some regional aspects. I mean, one of the big driving forces of change in the U.S. economy over the past couple of decades has been this kind of unequalizing as the knowledge economy has wanted to gravitate towards big cities with highly educated populations. And now there's going to be an additional factor, which is if companies want the kind of workers that they can get in those locations, are they going to want to locate in the states that are going to have really regressive social policies, the kinds of social policies that the workers they want really don't like? So you really have to think, how does Texas or Florida fare in this kind of competition for business in this new legal environment?
Florida seems to be doing pretty well. We saw Citadel move down there, and lots of other companies. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out over time. So, Paul, just wondering here, I think, as Tim and I speak to various fund managers and C-suite folks, one of the questions, obviously, today is this Federal Reserve. They have a balancing act, a very tough balancing act to rein in inflation while not going too far and pushing this economy into a recession. How do you think that plays out?
Well, the fundamental problem does not actually look to me to be all that hard. It's a weird thing to say, but it's pretty clear that the U.S. economy got overheated. Fiscal and monetary policy, it was misjudged. I was among the people who misjudged it, and the U.S. economy got overheated. And so we have, most of the inflation we're seeing is special factors that will go away. Russia won't invade Ukraine every month, but there's a good solid extra maybe 2 points of inflation, excess inflation that result from an overheated economy. Cooling off that overheating is not fundamentally a hard thing to do and needn't be all that hard, needn't even involve a recession, just a little bit of an uptick in the unemployment rate. The problem is precision. I mean, the Fed is not sure how overheated the economy is. It doesn't know exactly how much of a rate rise is needed to do this. So the chance of overdoing it, of slamming the brakes a little too hard and causing a bit of a skid is definitely there. So it's a reasonable chance that we'll have something that will be formally a recession, but the chance of a really, sort of early 80s type grueling and anti-inflation flight, that doesn't look serious.
How deep of a recession could we have? How long of a recession? How high could unemployment go?
How high it could go could be over, it probably has to rise over 4. And it's not hard to come up with a story in which the Fed bobbles the thing badly enough that it briefly goes above 5. But briefly, there's nothing at all in there to suggest that we need an unemployment rate that's over 5 for any extended period of time. And the Fed will course correct if it does look like we're heading in that direction.
So just to that point, Paul, Larry Sumner's is out with an idea. 5 years of 5% unemployment needed to bring down CPI. That doesn't necessarily seem to hold water to you?
That looks to me like Larry is, for reasons I do not understand, thinking that we need something that's like a sort of a half Volcker, that we need a massive period of excess unemployment for an extended period of time to crush inflationary expectations, so which is what we had in the early 80s. Except every indicator I look at says that inflationary expectations are actually pretty muted. When you consider the price of gas, the fact that surveys are showing that people expect only 3% inflation over the next 5 years, that the break-even rate in the bond market is well under 3% now. I just don't understand where the idea that we need to do something like a Volcker in the economy of 22 is coming from.
But what about the idea that so much of this inflation is outside of the Fed's control and so much is due to supply constraints, and the Fed, has famously blunt tools. How can the Fed get this under control if they can't drill for oil, if they can't refine oil, and if they can't build houses?
No, what the Fed does is it give me the monetary policy to deal with the things I can and to accept the things I can't.
The mantra of Jay Powell, right?
These things will pass. That's the whole point. I mean, the big misjudgment that many of us made was to focus only on these things and think that they were transitory and would pass fairly quickly. But they will pass. And so what the Fed needs to do is to get some kind of underlying inflation rate back to around this 2% range. And then the other stuff will eventually, gas prices are already coming down. So think about the things that really are the appropriate targets of monetary policy.
On a global perspective, Paul, a lot of folks have said that the U.S. Federal Reserve is behind the curve, but I look across the pond and I see the Bank of England, 25 basis points. We heard from Christine Lagarde at the ECB that they're thinking about raising interest rates next meeting. How do you think about the European response, and maybe even from the Bank of Japan as well, relative to where the Fed is?
Well, the funny thing about monetary policy is that monetary policy starts having an effect before it actually happens, right? So we look at the actual amount by which the Fed has raised rates, and it isn't that much yet. But if you look at the rates that matter for the economy, mortgage rates, corporate bond rates, they're way, way up. So the anticipation of future Fed rate hikes has already done a lot. And the peculiar thing is that although the ECB hasn't raised rates as much as the Fed, those indicators of what people are expecting are every bit as big, if anything bigger, in Europe than they are right now. De facto, the ECB is pursuing a tighter monetary policy than the Fed is, which seems to me to be crazy. The underlying inflation rate in Europe is probably substantially lower than it is here. They didn't have an American Rescue Plan. They don't have the rapid wage increases that we've been seeing. So my concern is not that the ECB is behind the curve. My concern is actually that the ECB is way ahead of the curve, and that they're going to do what historically the ECB has tended to do, which is to over-contract.
Interesting. All right, so you mentioned kind of wages, and that's kind of where I wanted to go. The labor market has been just spectacular. We've got more job openings than we know what to do with here. Are you concerned? Do you think we will, in fact, see meaningful wage inflation? Because the 5%, we see is just not keeping up with that headline number.
Yeah, well, the numbers. Wage rates now are rising. It depends on. We're having a lot of problems with adjusting because we have a changing composition. The pandemic and all of that has really screwed up with our ability to interpret the data. But I would have said that we seem to be having wage growth in the 5-ish% range, which, given productivity growth, is underlying inflation in the probably 4 or a bit less range, which is consistent with the other indicators we have. So basically, and wage growth, if anything, seems to be slowing, even though we haven't yet had significant rise in unemployment, it looks as if the wage numbers are coming down a bit. So wages are they're not an additional problem. They're basically telling the same story as everything else is.
Well, I have some anecdotal evidence of inflation.
Did you get a raise?
The best hoagies in the world are Hoagie Haven from Princeton, New Jersey. And they actually did raise the prices on the hoagies there. I was down there a couple of weeks ago, and they haven't raised it since 1982.
Wow.
I mean, I don't think so.
So they're making up for some lost time.
So Paul Krugman down in Princeton, you are seeing some inflation down there.
Oh, yeah. I mean, look, lots of things. I mean, it's I'm surprised, actually, given the way that a lot of companies have behaved, they didn't just make the hoagies smaller, which would both be a way to conceal the price increase and probably be good for your health.
Shrinkflation. It's a real thing. I've actually noticed it happening with ice cream. The ice cream containers I'm buying are smaller. Paul, I'm wondering about the peak federal funds rate. If you would give a prediction as to where you think it'll end up.
Yeah, I mean, that's a mystical art, and even the people who do it well do it badly. So I say 300 basis points. But what do I know? And the truth is, nobody knows. Jay Powell doesn't know. We really are. The Fed is feeling its way forward here, as it should be. I mean, any attempt to lock in a rigid path, given the uncertainties about not just about the effects of policy, but even about where we are. I mean, the U.S. economy is clearly overheated. How much overheated? I don't know. So no, I mean, this is I don't have any reason to think that my guess is that the markets are probably overstating how much the Fed is going to raise rates. That it's probably we're probably going to be seeing, just as inflation went up faster than people thought it would as the economy overheated, inflation probably come down faster than people thought it would as the economy cools off. Okay. But I can't give you a number on that.
Okay, well, last question, just in the last 30 seconds that we have with you. What's the biggest economic risk that lies ahead for the U.S. economy?
Oh, I mean, right now, I mean, there's short term, long term, there's all these horrible things like climate change and war and all that. But short term, I think the biggest risk is that the Fed will overdo it, that it'll slam on the brakes too hard.
All right, there you have it. Paul Krugman, Nobel laureate economist, New York Times columnist. He's distinguished professor of economics at the City University of New York Graduate Center. He's the author or editor of more than 24 books, joining us via Zoom from Princeton, New Jersey. Paul Krugman, really appreciate your time this afternoon. Thanks so much for joining us on Bloomberg Business Week. Let's now get a check of the latest when it comes to the markets, because we've got 90 minutes to go to the close, Charlie Pellet.
Indeed, Tim, and we are solidly in the green. We're off session highs, but still looking at a 660-point jump in the Dow, up right now by 2.1%. The S&P, again, close to best levels of the day, up 93 points now, up 2.5%. The NASDAQ Composite Index is up 283, also up by 2.5%. Stocks surged, a rally in Treasuries waned after a reading on inflation expectations eased, and the Federal Reserve's Jim Bullard suggested recession fears are overdone. 10-year yield now 3.11%. Spot gold up 0.4% to $18.30. West Texas Intermediate crude oil is up 3.3%, 107.73 for a barrel of WTI. Bitcoin close to 21,000. Bitcoin right now up by 0.8%. The University of Michigan's National Consumer Sentiment Index dropped this month to a record low. Decades high inflation, a slump in stock prices, and fears of a recession are casting a pall on the economic outlook. Joanne Shu is the director of surveys at the University of Michigan. She was interviewed this morning on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
This month, we're seeing personal financial questions, sentiment also going down at the same time that the macroeconomic sentiment is going down as well. So at this point, the number one concern on people's minds that we're hearing throughout the survey is inflation, inflation, inflation. It's impossible to ignore.
And we do have bank stocks rallying. All major banks passed a stress test by the Fed, showing they could withstand a severe recession. J.P. Morgan Chase shares, they're up by 2.7%. Citigroup shares up 3.3%, Wells Fargo up 7.3%, Bank of America up by 0.8%. Again, recapping 10-year yield 3.11%, S&P up 2.5%, spot gold up 0.4 to $18.30 the ounce. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Thank you so much for that update, Charlie Pellet. Well, we're continuing our coverage of the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe v. Wade, wiping out the constitutional right to abortion. Earlier in the afternoon, President Joe Biden weighed in. Check out what he had to say.
It's a realization of an extreme ideology and a tragic error by the Supreme Court, in my view. The court has done what it has never done before, expressly take away a constitutional right that is so fundamental to so many Americans that had already been recognized.
That was President Joe Biden with his initial response, at least, to the Roe v. Wade ruling today, or the ruling overturning Roe v. Wade. Joining us in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studios, June Grasso, Bloomberg News legal analyst. She and I spent most of the morning together today talking about this story, and I know since that time she has literally been poring over this statement and the case. What's new?
Well, this morning we were talking about, the repercussions of this decision and what it might mean for contraception and gay marriage and all these decisions based on privacy. And the dissent predicted that, quote, no one should be confident that this majority is done with its work. And Justice Thomas, in his concurrence, he actually said we should reconsider all of the court's substantive due process precedents, including Griswold, that's privacy, Lawrence, that's marriage, and Obergefell, which is same-sex marriage. So he's inviting people to challenge that. So people who say, let's not panic, read that opinion. It's
so
time
you're
to panic.
saying, June, you are saying that Justice Clarence Thomas, in the text today, is essentially inviting cases to overturn gay marriage, to overturn the right to be in a same-sex relationship?
Yes, and he has succeeded. He has been saying that people should challenge the Second Amendment, and the Second Amendment was was a secondary, people considered it a secondary constitutional right. It wasn't like on the same level as the First Amendment, et cetera. And he won with that one yesterday, so,
So anything in the... There's really nothing surprising in how the vote went down. Is that right?
There's nothing surprising because we got that draft.
Okay. And do we know anything more about that, where that may have come from?
No, we don't know anything about that. And that's sort of what's puzzling to me is that, now, my opinion, this is just my opinion.
Okay.
No basis in fact for this, but we know it is true that the Chief Justice decided that the Supreme Court marshal would do the investigation instead of, for example, the FBI.
Okay.
That lets them have control over what the marshal finds. They may know at this point who leaked that. They may not tell us.
Why does that matter so much?
Well, it matters to the court because after that leak, Justice Clarence Thomas said something to the effect of, I'm looking over my shoulder now. It has destroyed the confidence and trust on the court. And it's something that they want to find out so that it doesn't happen again.
It's interesting that you mentioned the confidence and trust of the court because Susan Collins, Senator Susan Collins, voted to confirm Kavanaugh and Gorsuch. And earlier today, she put out a statement that said this decision is inconsistent with what Justices Gorsuch and Kavanaugh said in their testimony and their meetings with me, where they both were insistent on the importance of supporting longstanding precedents that the country has relied upon.
Well, it's not only inconsistent with what they told her. Also, Joe Manchin said something similar, Senator Joe Manchin. But all of the conservative Supreme Court justices in their testimony, because I've gone back, said that Roe is an established right, even Justice Alito. So he said that then, and Kavanaugh was really emphatic about it. It's an established right. It's been established.
Did their minds change when they were the oral arguments, or would it be fair to say that they perhaps weren't necessarily being truthful in their testimony?
I don't want to say they weren't being truthful in their testimony. Perhaps the way they felt the way they worded it. I mean, I have to say that Amy Coney Barrett, Justice Amy Coney Barrett, was more forthcoming in her testimony. She said it's not a super right, whatever she called it, a super precedent. So she said it's a precedent, but not a super precedent. She said that only super precedents can be overturned.
Is that a thing? I don't.
It's not a thing.
You went to law school. Is that a chapter I missed?
It wasn't a thing at Harvard. I don't know if it, maybe where'd she go? She went to Notre Dame. So.
All right. Noah Feldman, Bloomberg Opinion column. So I'm going to call out and refer to this note probably a couple times today, out with a column today. And the title just grabbed me, the headline, Abortion Ruling is Suicidal for the Supreme Court. Boy, that's strong language there.
It's strong language, but we have a Supreme Court that the supermajority on the court now is out of step with the majority of Americans, because in every single poll...
And that kind of goes to how you interpret the Constitution. Is it just a concrete thing that doesn't change?
Yes.
Or does it expand and contract with society and evolve and things like that?
When Justice Scalia was alive, he and Justice Breyer would do these sort of dueling Constitution lectures, and Justice Scalia would talk about originalism and textualism, and Justice Breyer would talk about the living Constitution.
Yes.
The problem now is you have 6 people who believe in textualism and some who are real adherents to textualism. So that's how we got, I believe, to these 2 decisions, which yesterday they went back to the 1700s and 1800s. Today's decision, they went back to the 1500s, 1600s. I mean, it's jarring for someone to think that, I think the founders were very wise, but how could the founders anticipate the kind of world we have today?
I mean, look what the founders included in the Constitution about slavery.
Exactly.
And then you have to look no further than the 14th Amendment to understand that that document was something that has been living and changing.
That's why this decision today is so shaking.
Right.
It's sort of put you off balance, because, what about precedent now? Does that mean that they're not going to rely on precedent anymore? It's very scary in a way.
Well, we'll certainly keep turning to you. That's June Grasso. She's Bloomberg News legal analyst, also the host of Bloomberg Law, weeknights at 10 p.m. Wall Street time on Bloomberg Radio, with us in the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. Let's get a check on the latest world and national news now. For that, we go to Nancy Lyons in D.C. Hey, Nance.
Thanks, Tim. President Biden says today's Supreme Court ruling overturning the Roe v. Wade decision on abortion means it'll now be up to voters to elect leaders to Congress who will vote to legislate abortion rights into federal law.
This is a sad day for the country, in my view. But it doesn't mean the fight's over. Let me be very clear and unambiguous. The only way we can secure a woman's right to choose, the balance that existed, is for Congress to restore the protections of Roe v. Wade as federal law.
Biden says he'll make sure the Justice Department will ensure women who live where abortion is outlawed will be able to freely travel to states where it is legal. Kelly Robinson is executive director of the Planned Parenthood Action Fund.
The impact is going to be immediate. There are 13 states that will ban abortion immediately, and 26 states over the course of the next couple of months will ban access to abortion care. That's hundreds of thousands of people that will be impacted each year.
Robinson says the majority of the country is against banning abortion. The nation's largest nurses union, National Nurses United, says abortions will not stop, but they will be less safe. Carol Tobias is the president of the National Right to Life and is celebrating today's news.
The Supreme Court has correctly decided the right to kill unborn children is not in the U.S. Constitution. So this is just a great day for mothers and their babies.
Carol Tobias criticized Democrats for moving to reverse today's ruling, saying they would prefer no limits on abortion. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Nancy Lyons.
Thank you so much for that update, Nancy Lyons. Tim Stenovec and Paul Sweeney live in the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. We were busy yesterday, Paul, with the Supreme Court decision as well.
That's right.
Which essentially allowed states to, well, it's interesting. It was really focused on New York, but there were a handful of other states included in here, including Hawaii, California, Rhode Island, and others. In fact, where about a quarter of the population of America resides. And now, in the wake of that, New York officials are rushing to draft new gun rules after the court decision.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see. We saw Governor Hochul and Mayor Adams come out yesterday pretty forcefully, saying that they're going to look at some legislative remedies on their part for the state of New York and the city of New York. But this is a pretty, it's a pretty significant piece of, that came out from the Supreme Court yesterday, a ruling. But, I also saw stories of people running to the gun stores and starting the application process and doing all that. So, different parts of the state, I'm sure there are different views of this.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I talked to a friend of mine yesterday who does have guns. He lives in the state of New York, and he sees this as being welcome news because right now, in order for him to get to the gun range, he has to drive directly to the range. He doesn't live in New York City. He has to drive directly from his home to the gun range. He's not allowed to stop for gas. He's not allowed to stop to go to the bathroom. But if he gets one of these permits, he will be allowed to do those things. And it has, what he says has created a real burden for him. I think the question for us, Paul, who are residing in the cities or come into the cities each and every day are, what are the locations where guns will not be allowed?
Right.
Hospitals, office buildings,
Right.
the subway?
Yeah, exactly. They're calling them sensitive places. That's the term that's being used. And again, I think at some point they wanted to say all of Manhattan was a sensitive place. That didn't work. But schools, presumably?
I hope so.
I would hope so. I don't know.
When you go to other states, sometimes you see those signs up that say, like, no firearms allowed inside here. I wonder about bars, too, where alcohol is served.
Yep.
I mean, perhaps it would be a good idea not to include weapons in those locations?
Yeah, but a lot of states, I suspect that they do, but we'll have to see how it develops here in New York.
All right, to be continued. Paul Sweeney, Tim Stanivek, live in the Interactive Broker Studios in New York.
updates, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, the Bloomberg Business app, and at Bloomberg Quick Take. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. We've got stocks trading very close to session highs. I'm looking at a 95-point jump right now for the S&P 500 index, up today by 2.5%, on track for a winning week. In fact, on track for the best week in nearly a month. Stocks are surging. A rally in treasuries waned after a reading of inflation expectations eased, and the Fed's Jim Bullard suggested recession fears are overdone. The S&P again up by 2.5%. The Dow's up 680 points, a gain right now of 2.2%. NASDAQ is up 300 points, higher by 2.7%. 10-year yield 3.12%. Spot gold is up 0.4%, $18.30 the ounce, while West Texas Intermediate crude oil is up 3%, $107.40 for a barrel of WTI. After earnings, FedEx shares are rallying. FedEx up right now by 7.2%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Thanks so much for that update, Charlie Pellet. Tim Stenovic and Paul Sweeney. We're live in the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. Our coverage of the Supreme Court's overturning of Roe v. Wade continues this afternoon. We're very pleased right now to be joined by Sonia Osorio, the president of the National Organization for Women in New York City. The National Organization for Women is the largest organization of feminist grassroots activists in the United States. Sonia joining us this afternoon from the city. Sonia, good afternoon. I want to just, I think this decision for a lot of people was anticipated because of the leak from May. But I'm wondering your reaction as soon as you saw, just after 10 o'clock Wall Street time, the Supreme Court's ruling.
I've been checking my phone over the last days, with each passing day being a little bit more nervous, knowing that the decision was imminent. And I have to say, it still was shocking to see. And my reaction was certainly one that was shared by many, many people. I mean, my phone has just been blowing up all day with people's just shock and fear and disappointment over the turn of events here in this country for women. A right that we have had for more than 50 years to fundamentally be able to make decisions about our lives, about our bodies. And it's moving forward. It's going to be a very, very difficult situation for a lot of people, particularly imminently as this change starts to take place.
So that's kind of where I wanted to go, Sonia. How do you anticipate this practically unrolling over the upcoming days, weeks, and months? I know you and your organization and others have been, kind of thinking about this and probably planning for it to some degree. How do you think this is going to play out?
Well, we have Texas and Oklahoma to look at for what has happened over the last 8 weeks or so there. Some of the stories that we are hearing are just devastating. We have the states that remain legal, that are in the vicinity of those states, where there may have only been one clinic to begin with, are up to 5 and 6 weeks with a waiting period. So you can imagine, for those women who are pregnant now and are looking for care, it's a panicked scramble to figure out what to do. And there's one woman's story that resonates so much with me to think about what so many women and families are going through. This was a Texas woman who had to drive to Virginia to get to a clinic because that was the soonest she could get an appointment, which she needed to get one soon. She had to do it. So what this meant for her family was her and her husband packed up their 2 little kids, drove to Virginia, had the appointment, and they had to get back in the car and drive back because this family, these parents, had to get to their job in the morning. That's the burden that the U.S. government is putting on women and their families in our country now. And when you think about what women have been through over the last 2 years and what they're going through now, from baby formula shortages, child care shortages and outrageous prices for childcare, the she-cession, losing their jobs at really high rates, inflation, gas at more than $5 a gallon. It's the she-cession, losing their jobs at really high rates, inflation, gas at more than $5 a gallon. It's really, really a big problem for families.
So,
go ahead.
Sonia, I wonder from a medical perspective what this means for people, for women who are pregnant but then find themselves with pregnancy challenges. Perhaps their pregnancy was planned, but then they find that it's an ectopic pregnancy, perhaps, or that there's no way that she will be able to carry the baby to term because of genetic mutations within the embryo. What are those women to do?
Well, I really appreciate you bringing that up because it's such a significant point. You know, that's really when things become a very serious healthcare issues. And the talk about morality or ideology and what people think about abortion in general really goes out the window when we're talking about people's health and life. And, you know, this has always been a problem. I mean, this has been a problem for a very long time, particularly for the later term abortions, if they're needed. Very, very few places do them. And it's a huge burden to women. So it's just going to compound that. It's absolutely going to compound that. And, you know, also, let's keep it into perspective. We've lost Roe v. Wade, but the truth is that it's been death by 1,000 cuts for a number of years. Every year at the state level, there are so many restrictions put into place. And there have been women who haven't had access to for any kind of reproductive health care of this sort, anything that's convenient or within their state.
Sonia, what do you expect to develop here in the city of New York, in the state of New York? How do you think this will play out in terms of response?
Right. So we are certainly going to be seeing those women who have to get on a plane to come to New York City to have those terminations that are endangering their health. And you know, one of the things that the National Organization for Women here is launching is it's an escort service of sorts, a buddy system, so that people who are coming, we can connect people who are coming to the city for services with locals here who will help them navigate the city, help them make appointments, go to the appointment with them if they want, whatever the volunteers are comfortable doing. It may be even offering them a place to stay. We certainly are asking people to donate at this point to the many funds that exist to help cover the cost for people that are going to need to travel. And that's particularly important now because as we've talked about, it's a crunch time now for people who are pregnant with all the changes that have been happening. And there are clinics who have been shutting down their operations over the last couple of weeks because they have businesses that have to be shut down, and they've started that process. So it's a very it's a dangerous time right now, but we are going to be working to making sure that those avenues for people to be able to get the care that they need if they have to travel here or to the other. You know, there's only 16 states in the country.
Sonia, we unfortunately have to leave it there, but we really appreciate you taking the time. We know you're very busy today. Sonia Osorio is the president of the National Organization for Women in New York City. The National Organization for Women is the largest organization of feminist grassroots activists here in the United States. We are just a few minutes away from our countdown to the close simulcast on Bloomberg TV. Coming up next, we're going to be joined by our friends at Bloomberg TV as we count you down to the market close, just over an hour until the equity market closes.
minutes of cross-platform coverage ahead of the U.S. market close starts right now.
This is Countdown to the Close with 60 minutes left in the trading session. Taylor Rigg, Shonali Bassett, Katie Greifeld, now of course joined by our wonderful colleagues Tim Stanovic and Paul Sweeney. We together welcome in our full Bloomberg audiences across TV, radio, YouTube, and today is always continuing to watch the markets, but I know of course earlier this morning, just after 10 a.m. Eastern, the U.S. Supreme Court really has continued to be the top story of the day. The court, as we know, overturning Roe v. Wade decision and wiping out the constitutional right to abortion. Our Bloomberg Washington correspondent Joe Matthew and host of Sound On live outside the nation's top court. And Joe, I think what's interesting, we've heard from the president, we've heard from Nancy Pelosi, we're hearing from Kevin McCarthy. What are you sort of gathering from all of the politicians coming out?
Well, they really represent all sides of the spectrum here. President Biden speaking to the nation earlier in what was a formal address in the Cross Hall, something that we normally see in more of a prime time environment, calling this a sad day for the court and for America, urging people to elect more Democrats to the Senate so they can pass legislation that would legalize the right to an abortion. Kevin McCarthy very much on the other side here, calling this a vindication for the pro-life movement. And we've seen both sides come together in front of the courthouse as well. Protesters in the hundreds and now in the thousands. A growing group have been out there since even before the ruling was announced. People showed up with signs chanting before they even knew if this case was going to be decided today. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez among the politicians that have waded into that crowd to rally them. And you're going to see in the next several months, Democrats and Republicans try to capitalize this for their benefit on the campaign trail.
Well, let's talk more about that, Joe. Tim Stanovic here at Bloomberg headquarters. I'm wondering what this means politically for Democrats specifically, because much of the narrative has focused on voters voting on the economy, on inflation, on high gas prices. Is there a chance that this galvanizes voters, not just Democrats, but Republicans who are pro-choice, and says, hey, we need to elect more Democrats because they're the ones who are going to help us out here?
I think it's likely, if not guaranteed. I don't know how you'd rank those issues. Inflation and the economy will likely drive most voters' decisions at the polls, but there are also a lot of single-issue voters in this country. And as Elizabeth Warren put it, if you want to see a revolution, ban abortion. They're expecting this to be a mobilizing effort for Democrats, a mobilizing factor that increases turnout in what would otherwise be a lackluster year for the party in power in a midterm off-year election cycle here. The president himself said today that Roe will be on the ballot in November.
Really appreciate it. Well said. Joe Matthew, of course, you know him from Sound On. And of course, we continue to keep our eyes on the equity markets as well here, an end of the trading day and end of the trading week. Green on the screen near the highs of the session. You're up 2.5% pretty much on the S&P, the NASDAQ 100, Russell as well, 2,000. Some of those small cap, more domestically focused stocks, those are up 2.6%. I guess you could call it only the relative laggard on the day, the Dow, but you're still up 2.25%, and you're on higher with decent volume.
Yeah, higher. Let's talk sectors. What's rising? Financials are up more than 3.5%. That is your biggest gainer of the day. It's followed closely by materials, industrials, communication services still getting a bit of more than 3%. Healthcare is rising the least on the day, but still in the green of more than 1%.
And if we dial down into some of the individual names, I picked all green names because that's really what was out there. Let's start with Carnival. Better than feared second quarter earnings report. Reported a smaller loss per share than last year. Carnival up double digits, lifting the rest of the travel industry as well. You can see Wynn Resorts up almost 11%. Wells Fargo, Shonali, this is just for you. Up after Wall Street passed the Fed stress test with flying colors, potentially paving the way to shareholder payouts. Wells Fargo actually best day since October 2021. And also CarMax, just one more earnings story. It beat on EPS, net sales and operating revenue, also a little bit better than expected. CarMax up 6.5% or so. And I think what's so interesting is the trend today has certainly not been the trend that we've seen. I'm taking a look here at this terminal, not to totally go against what Katie said, but this is the long-term trend of defensives, Tim, relative to the MSCI world. And defensives have been the big outperformers. Now, of course, a little bit of that today reverses, but this has sort of been the conversation in the market is, are we getting defensive? Are we preparing for a recession? How do you position yourself if you're worried about some of those cyclicals? And so we have some of a little bit long-term outperformance here of the defensives.
Okay, well, speaking of a potential recession, we had a great chat with Paul Krugman, the Nobel laureate, New York Times columnist, the author and editor of more than 24 books. And he mentioned that if there is a recession, it's not necessarily going to be one that's deep. He doesn't see the unemployment rate getting over 5% for a significant period of time. In fact, he thinks it might just get above 4% if there is some sort of recession, or if we do see the unemployment rate rise as a result of what the Fed is doing. But he does still think that the biggest risk to the economy moving forward, at least in the long term, is that the Fed does overdo it.
Yeah, I'm looking at this market here, Tim. I mean, again, up 2.5% on the S&P. I'm also looking at volume. Is there volume supporting this move higher? And looking at the S&P, the volume's kind of in line with what it's been over the past 30 days. So not a big conviction day from a volume perspective, which a lot of pros look for when they see big moves in the marketplace.
And I am curious, guys, when we think about, Katie, and I'll punt this on over to you, the big sort of yields that have been falling down as of late, that was sort of inflation break-evens rolling over as well. Wondering if we're getting calls for the peak hawkishness of the Federal Reserve. If we're thinking if they're really hawkish, does that mean that we're getting lower inflation and lower growth on the horizon? Today, of course, some of that falls out a little bit as yields are rising, but a lot of that peak sort of inflation break-evens are behind us in many cases.
That's what's been so interesting, that you have sort of seen that peak perhaps in break-evens. Whether it's actually the peak in actual inflation in the economy remains to be seen, but it seems that there's a verdict, at least in the bond market.
There's a reason that employers and employees would want those peaks, and that's because you've already been seeing a lot of job cuts. Think about the headlines this week alone, guys.
Yeah.
JP Morgan, Netflix, and you've got to wonder what that means for the unemployment future in the next couple of months.
Yeah, because you think about it, the labor market, the consumer's been very strong here. We know we had obviously that big pullback in the beginning of the pandemic, but labor came right back, and now we've got very low unemployment. We've had some good growth in wages. The consumer is still there, of course, but maybe not discounting a recession.
Okay, so the big question, how should we be reading into the University of Michigan sentiment numbers this morning? Because we'd get a teeny little bit of a pullback on inflation expectations, Taylor. And it was enough to send the equity market higher in part, but at the same time, it's just a little bit of a pullback.
And it's still 3% or more, right?
Yeah.
For sort of the next couple of years out. I don't think that's near 2%, but you could check me on my math.
No, you're right. I just checked you. You're correct.
Thanks,
Good job.
Tim.
All right, well, that is...
California, you have my back.
I do, always. That is going to do it for our cross-platform coverage of our countdown to the close right now. Tune in just an hour, because we're going to be right back here for Beyond the Bell, our cross-platform coverage on Bloomberg TV, Bloomberg Radio, and on YouTube.
This is Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Bloomberg Quick Takes Tim Stenovic on Bloomberg Radio.
It's Bloomberg Business Week. Tim Stenovic and Paul Sweeney. We're live in the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. Paul, I want to go to something that you said during the simulcast that struck my interest. Conviction.
Yeah.
In the rally today, you referred to volume. So sort of take me into that and why how you're reading into the rally with that context.
You know, it's interesting. A lot of times when, I think it's in the context of people trying to say, hey, are we trying to call the bottom, which is always a very difficult thing to do.
I ask everyone who comes on if it's the bottom, and then I just get made fun
one
of.
of the things you hear from fund managers is, well, maybe one of the things I look at is when we start to bounce back, do we bounce back maybe with some conviction? Or if we have a big selling day, also, if you have a big selling day of 3, 4, 5%, and it's accompanied by much higher than average volume, if you have that for a day or 2 or 3, that might be laying in the grounds for bottoming, just getting people capitulating. I'm selling across the board, and we're not, we have not generally been seeing that.
Okay, so what we're seeing right now, at least in the change of, the change in volume compared with the average over the last 20 days, is that the right one to look at?
Yeah, WEI function I like to use on the Bloomberg terminal gives you the average volume relative to the last 30 days. And just looking at the S&P 500 today, for example, we're having a good, strong day up, but the volume's generally right in line with kind of where it's been over the last 30 days. So
not really
nothing, but just interesting, though. But a lot of folks, though, they all have their various things they look at, indicators for when maybe a market might be laying in a bottom and ready to turn. So we'll have to see.
I know it's a shortened trading week, but if we look at the last 5 days, the S&P 500 higher by more than 6%, the Dow higher by close to 5%, and the NASDAQ, Paul, up by 8.3%. We're going to continue our markets coverage over the next 2 hours. First, though, let's get a check on the latest world and national news. For that, we go to Nancy Lyons. She's in the 99.1 newsroom in Washington, D.C. Hey there, Nance.
Thanks, Tim. The U.S. Supreme Court has overturned the 1973 Roe v. Wade decision and wiped out the constitutional right to abortion. Today's ruling was 6-3. Bloomberg Law host June Grasso says Justice Clarence Thomas also opened the door to looking at previous protections for same-sex marriage and the use of contraception.
Justice Thomas, in his concurrence, he actually said we should reconsider all of the court's substantive due process precedents, including Griswold, that's privacy, Lawrence, that's marriage, and Obergefell, which is same-sex marriage. So people who say, let's not panic, read that opinion.
Bloomberg Law's June Grasso. Nobel laureate economist and New York Times columnist Paul Krugman tells Bloomberg today's decision could have an impact on businesses.
Are they going to want to locate in the states that are going to have really regressive social policies, the kinds of social policies that the workers they want really don't like? So you really have to think, how does Texas or Florida fare in this kind of competition for business in this new legal environment?
The economist Paul Krugman, some companies, including J.P. Morgan Chase and Meta, say they will reimburse women who travel to another state if needed to obtain a legal abortion. The governors of California, Washington, and Oregon are vowing to protect reproductive rights and help women from other states gain access to abortion. Well, getting lost a bit in today's Supreme Court news, the House has approved bipartisan gun safety legislation, sending it to President Biden to be signed into law. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Nancy Lyons.
Thank you so much for that update, Nancy Lyons. Tim Stenovic and Paul Sweeney live in the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio in New York. Paul, is your crypto safe?
My crypto is absolutely safe because I literally cash in my pocket. That's about as crazy as I get.
If you're watching on YouTube, you'll see Paul Sweeney holding up a wad of cash. That wouldn't be safe in my pocket because I would lose that. So you're a money clip guy?
I'm a money clip guy. And I am going out of fashion so quickly from the pandemic. I mean,
because it's all credit cards everywhere?
It's all credit cards everywhere, yeah, which is fine. But
you're like a big cash person.
I used to be. Now I'm actually evolving, as they say. But at least I have to have a couple of dollars on me.
You always do. You always do. You never know. Although now places are like, you try to give them $1 and they're like, we don't take cash.
That's right.
Okay. So, the reason I ask is because we have yet another story about vulnerabilities within the crypto space by our own crypto team, including Olga Karif, who's been covering these hacks. This time, hackers looting about $100 million from a so-called cryptocurrency bridge, again exposing a key vulnerability in the digital asset ecosystem. So last time this happened, Paul, Olga Karif came on Quick Take Stock. We asked her how people should think about their crypto and whether it's safe or not when using these bridges to transfer currencies from one platform to another or to change the type of currency. And she said that she recommended that people read the code. And I thought to myself, oh my God, wait, what? Read the what?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, you think about this, the technology for these bridges, they're often run by anonymous teams, Bloomberg News is reporting, and that in and of itself seems crazy. I guess you crowdfund your security, I don't know. But you just know that the hackers out there are so sophisticated, they may even be nation states, that I'm just not sure how you keep in front of this. But the folks that are in the crypto world and active in the crypto world, they think it's safer than putting it in a bank. So I just don't know. I just think when you look at the technology there, it's changing so quickly.
Nothing as safe as the cash in your pocket, Paul Sweeney. You're listening to Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, the Bloomberg Business app, and at Bloomberg Quick Take. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. Friday rally, stocks at the best level of the day, on track for the best week in nearly a month. Lots going on, so let's head right over to the first word breaking news desk for today's afternoon call. Here he is, Bailey Lipschultz.
Good afternoon, Charlie. As you said, stocks are trading at the day's highs on pace to cap their best week in about a month. The Dow is up 700 points, S&P higher by 95, with the Nasdaq gaining 300 points. The U.S. 10-year yield is at 3.12%, and small caps are up 30 points. All 11 main S&P sectors are trading higher by at least 1%, led by gains for materials and financials. Nasdaq Biotech's rise 35 points, transports are up 485, semis at 100 points, while the VIX is lower by 7.5%. Leaders in the Dow, Salesforce, Boeing, and Goldman Sachs, while Verizon and United Health are the only stocks trading in the red. On the earnings front, cruise stocks are among the day's top performers after Carnival's quarterly report was better than feared. FedEx jumped 7% after its guidance topped estimates, and Smith & Wesson rose after beating expectations and boosting its dividend. In deal news, Zendesk agreed to be taken out for $9.5 billion, and wrapping things up, Bausch Health surged after naming hedge fund manager John Paulson as chairman of the board. Live from the First Word Breaking News Desk, I'm Bailey Lipschultz. Charlie?
Okay, we thank you very much, Bailey. Have a great weekend to hear live breaking news over your Bloomberg Type Squawk SQUAWK on your terminal. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Thank you so much for that update, Charlie Pellet. Bloomberg Business Week is brought to you by Informatica. In the cloud, your data has the power to do the extraordinary. Manage data across any location in the cloud for accurate and actionable insights. More at Informatica.com.
All right, Tim, let's stick with the crypto storyline. We were just talking about a story where hackers looted about $100 million from a so-called cryptocurrency bridge, again, exposing key vulnerability in
That's
the
real
digital
money, Paul.
asset. That is real money, but that's the trend. That's clearly the trend. Danielle Dixon, CEO and Executive Director for Stellar Development Foundation, joins us on the phone from San Francisco. And Stellar, you know, it's interesting. It is a nonprofit organization using blockchain technology to unlock the world's economic potential by making money more fluid, markets more open, and people more empowered. Danielle, thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. I know you guys recently announced a partnership with MoneyGram. Tell us about that.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's a really awesome, we actually announced the launch of it. So it's really focused on reaching those 1.7 billion folks around the world that don't have access to the formal financial system. And it's really about giving these cash economies an opportunity to be able to get into crypto. Think about it from the standpoint of, we've said always, all along, that blockchain is about those folks out there who don't have access, and yet to be able to get on and to purchase assets, you had to have a bank account or a credit card. Well, you don't need to anymore, because you can walk into a MoneyGram location with your cash. You can make sure that you set this up in your digital wallet in advance, and then you can convert that cash into USDC on Stellar, and then hold those assets or do whatever you want with them in your wallet. And you can also do cash out, so that you can take the assets that you hold, you can convert them into cash by doing the same thing in reverse and going to MoneyGram and picking up your cash. So it's a really transformational opportunity. And while payments and getting access like this might not be the sexy part of crypto and the stuff that you guys were just talking about before, but this is what brings blockchain and crypto to the masses. So it's just so exciting for us to be able to see this.
Well, it is interesting you say that, Danelle, because I do think a lot about the promise of crypto and the idea of this sort of stateless currency and the idea of cross-border transactions being able to happen seamlessly. I was reminded of trying to, get $80 for a concert years ago from my friend who lives in England, and it was just impossible for him. It was impossible for him to send me the money. And at one point he was just like, you know what? Next time I'm in the U.S., I'll give you $80. And I'm like, don't even worry about it, Matt, because you're one of my best friends and I don't even care. And it was a great show. But Danelle, it brings me to my point about adoption. And Paul mentioned this most recent bridge attack of $100 million. It comes after we've seen other vulnerabilities with the bridge and other vulnerabilities with crypto. But it also comes at a time when the value of crypto has just fallen so much. And I'm wondering what that does for mass adoption. If people say, you know what, I was into this, but now I'm going to stay away because I don't want to touch this stuff. It's too volatile.
Well, first of all, when it comes to payments and when it comes to being able to move your assets, we really, really believe in stablecoins. And this relationship that we have with MoneyGram, with all these wallet partners out there, can leverage with MoneyGram.
Stablecoin, Danelle, as Katie Greifeld said yesterday,
Yeah.
stablecoin is almost a dirty word these days in crypto because of what happened with the, algorithmic stablecoins recently.
Well, I think that's an excellent point to bring up because stablecoins, coins that are called stablecoins should live up to their names and they should be stable. When you think about USDC, for example, that's the Circle issued stablecoin, it's backed 1-to-1 by fiat and they hold those and they actually keep it so it's transparent for folks to be able to see it. That's crucially important. We support those stablecoins that are issued globally. There are more than 30 issued on Stellar that are backed by their local fiat in much the same way. That's what we think is really important for that. So I want to talk, the recent turmoil in the crypto markets, I just want to emphasize that blockchain technology serves a purpose. It's serving the unbanked, the underbanked populations that are cash-based, and many of them don't have bank accounts. And these 2 billion people depend on cash for their livelihoods. What we're focused on, and what we've always been focused on, is making this real for them. So 60% of the world's adults globally operate in the informal economy in some capacity. And so if you think about giving them the opportunity to be able to hold their value in a way that's secure, that's in their hands, that they control, this is what you can do now when you walk into MoneyGram with your cash and put it into your whatever wallet you choose that's connected to this service. You can do that right now. MoneyGram's offering this for 0 fees for the first year to be able to get folks onboarded, to get them used to the service, and to be able to demonstrate the power of it. This is truly transformational and remarkable. And I think there's a lot of really interesting stuff going on in crypto and blockchain, but this is the bread and butter.
So as we get more and more, this becomes more and more of a retail product to the extent that it is adopted, kind of raises the question, regulation. Where do you think we are in the regulatory framework? Where do you think we're going? Is this an SEC type of issue or CFTC? How do you think about it?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. I think domestically in the U.S., we're going to first see regulation around the issue that you just raised on stablecoins. I think we'll see actually some stablecoin legislation. We already see some bills being proposed that's going to give us some clarifying language there that'll make it so that financial institutions that are not banks will be able to issue stablecoins and do it in a way that's valuable to the end consumer. And I think we see a lot of these administrative bodies right now out there really tackling these issues in different ways. And I'll just tell you what I think. I think the most important thing is that governments have always been super successful and really good at regulating money. They've done this from the very beginning, whether it was paper money that we're used to today or gold. So we already have all of these activities set out in all these different regulatory bodies. Right. They know how to regulate the activity. Stop focusing on the technology layer and focus on the activity, because the truth of the matter is it's not that different.
Danelle Dixon.
When we focus there, we're going to see we don't need that.
Danelle Dixon, CEO and Executive Director of the Stellar Development Foundation, joining us on the phone from San Francisco. You're listening to Bloomberg Business Week. Tim Stenovec and Paul Sweeney live in the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio in New York. This is Bloomberg.
Broadcasting live from the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers Studio in New York. Bloomberg 1130. To Washington, D.C., Bloomberg 99.1. To Boston, Bloomberg 106.1. To San Francisco, Bloomberg 960. To the country, Sirius XM Channel 119. And around the globe, the Bloomberg Business app and BloombergRadio.com. This is Bloomberg Business Week.
It's Bloomberg Business Week. Paul Sweeney and Tim Stanavek. We're live in the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers Studio in New York. Listeners of the program will remember just a few weeks ago, it was actually back in May, we featured a story by Cynthia Coons all about the abortion pill. RU486 is what it was known as and has been known as. We're going to check back in with her about what the Roe v. Wade ruling means now that that ruling has come down. First, though, we're less than a half hour away from the close of trading. Here's Charlie Pellet.
Thank you very much, Tim. And ahead of a weekend, we are looking at gains in stocks. Not only gains, but we're trading at the best level of the day. Right to the numbers. We'll give you the why and some color in a moment. But the color right now is green, up 99 points, up 2.6%. The Dow up 722 points, up 2.4%. The NASDAQ Composite Index up 304 points, up 2.7%. The NASDAQ 100 Index up 2.7%. 10 years down 10-30 seconds. 10-year yield 3.12%. Spot gold up $4 the ounce to $18.26, up 0.2%. And a rally for West Texas Intermediate crude today up 3%, 107.45 for a barrel of WTI. Well, as for the Federal Reserve and the market backdrop, Michael Bell is global market strategist at J.P. Morgan Asset Management in London.
Valuations now, with the exception of some of the growth stocks in the U.S., which are still trading on a P of about 21, which is really remarkably high given how fast stocks have fallen already so far this year. But the value sector of the market trading on a P of about 13 in the US, and equities outside of the US, which are generally trading on Ps of somewhere like 10 to 12, valuations look pretty reasonable.
S&P on track for its best week in nearly a month. Sentiment improved after the University of Michigan's gauge of longer-term consumer inflation expectations settled back from an initially reported 14-year high, potentially reducing the urgency for steeper Federal Reserve rate increases. Again, the 10-year 3.12%, gold up 0.2%, crude, as I mentioned, up by 3%. FedEx shares after last night's earnings report rallying now by 7.1%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Thank you so much for that update, Charlie Pellet. Well, those of you who've listened to the show regularly for the last few months might remember that back in February, Bloomberg Business Week published a story about the abortion pill, that it's safer than Tylenol, yet almost impossible to get. We thought it would be a good time to check back in with Cynthia Coons, who wrote that story for Bloomberg Business Week. Cynthia is U.S. healthcare reporter for Bloomberg News. She joins us on the phone from Denver this afternoon. Cynthia, good to have you back with us, and a really important day for you to be with us, too. You know, I shared this with you last time I was here, but I think I was back in high school when the pill known as RU486 was approved by the FDA. And it seemed like such a big deal at the time, and it certainly made a lot of news at the time. But we don't hear about that method of abortion being used much in this day and age.
Yeah, it's really astounding, actually. There's a lack of knowledge about the abortion pill and a lot of confusion between the abortion pill and Plan B, which is a contraceptive that a person can take within, I think, 72 hours if they want to prevent a pregnancy. It's not the same thing as terminating a pregnancy, but there's a lot of confusion between what these different treatments are. And it's really hard to understand given, like you say, some 20 years ago when this was approved, this was this watershed moment. It had a lot of media attention. I think part of what's been going on here is the FDA put some restrictions on the pill back then, a number of restrictions on the pill that have remained in place largely to this day. They've started to change like a few around the margin, but they basically regulated it as though it's a much more dangerous drug than any of the studies into it show that it actually is. It's quite a safe medication, as the research would show, but the FDA has been sort of regulating it in a much more extreme way. So there hasn't been a lot of education, a lot of knowledge, and there's just not as much utilization as you would expect. I think it's just now hitting about the 50%, a little more than 50% of abortions done by pill, but the vast majority of abortions in America are done within a time frame within which women could use this method of abortion. So it just is this very untapped piece of the abortion puzzle.
All right, Cynthia, given the ruling we had today, is this abortion pill maybe the next battleground for the courts?
Yeah, that's exactly what I would say. So basically what has to happen now is there's this issue going on in that states that were already oppositional to abortion have had laws on the books that prevent access to the pill. In some cases outright, in some cases preventing it being, done through telemedicine or other ways that just curb its usage. And so now in states that are going to outright ban abortion, as that starts to play out, there becomes this question of whether or not states have the ability to what's known as sort of preempt what's the federal law. The federal law being that the FDA is the medical kind of governing body for medicines for the whole of the country. And the FDA says this drug is safe and can be used for this purpose, being abortion. And so if the FDA is saying that, can a state have a law that runs counter to the FDA on a medication? And so basically this is the next big legal battleground that is going to start to play out. As I imagine, I think there's a lot of regrouping going on right now and strategizing, but it's definitely going to be part of the legal puzzle because it's a very kind of clear-cut way to get at this access problem. If you can say, okay, no, the federal government, the FDA has the federal government's backing, and therefore this abortion pill should be legal in all states, then it becomes at least one avenue. It does not solve the problem because many women still need abortions after that window of time in which the pill is an option, but it certainly could be one way to preserve access to abortion for people in the earliest stages of pregnancy.
So Cynthia, take us on to the battleground and how you think pro-choice community will try to keep access to this, while at the same time the pro-life community will come out and try to prevent access to it.
I think it's going to be a lot of what we've already seen so far, and I think it's definitely going to continue. I think this pill legal battle is one of the big ones to pay attention to. I believe there have been some talk of religious freedom cases around access to abortion and someone's religious freedom. Is that an argument? I'm not a legal expert. I cover healthcare. I think there are definitely a number of avenues. I will say that this has been going on for years. I think some of this sort of like road to overturning Roe is a years-long road because there have been the anti-abortion group have been effectively passing laws all over the country that mirror one another, pushing them into districts and courts that work their way up to the Supreme Court. So they're bringing every possible strategy. And I just don't think any of that is going to stop, really. It's just this has a very chilling effect on the ability for the pro-abortion movement to fight for access right now.
Cynthia Coons, U.S. healthcare reporter for Bloomberg News. She joins us this afternoon on the phone from Denver. Make sure to check out her story. It was in Bloomberg Business Week back in February, the cover story. The abortion pill is safer than Tylenol, yet almost impossible to get. You're listening to Bloomberg Business Week. Tim Stenevec and Paul Sweeney. We go to Washington, D.C. now for a check of the latest world and national news. Hey there, Nancy Lyons.
Thanks, Tim. President Biden condemns the Supreme Court's ruling overturning the landmark Roe v. Wade ruling that protected abortion rights nationwide. He says the justices stripped Americans of a fundamental right that's been in place for half a century.
My administration will use all of its appropriate lawful powers, but Congress must act. And with your vote, you can act. You can have the final word. This is not over.
Speaker Nancy Pelosi is promising to enshrine abortion rights in national law if Democrats can win majorities in the Congress. Bloomberg's Irv Chapman with more.
Pelosi said as a result of the Supreme Court decision, American women have less freedom today than their mothers.
The Republicans are plotting a nationwide abortion ban. They cannot be allowed to have a majority in the Congress to do that. This is deadly serious. A woman's right to choose reproductive freedom is on the ballot in November.
The Republican leaders of House and Senate used Twitter to voice their approval of the Supreme Court's action. In Washington, Irv Chapman, Bloomberg Radio.
Pro-choice and pro-life activists have been making their voices heard at the Supreme Court today. Bloomberg's Washington correspondent Joe Matthew is there.
Capitol Police have really lined themselves up around this whole area between the Supreme Court and the U.S. Capitol. And we know that the justices are being protected at their homes as well.
Again, Bloomberg's Joe Matthew. He'll have more coverage today on Bloomberg Sound On at 5 p.m. Wall Street time. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Nancy Lyons.
Thank you so much for that update, Nancy Lyons. Tim Stenovec and Paul Sweeney. We are live in the Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio in New York. Inflation expectations. Okay, this is what I was referring to when we were talking to our friends at Bloomberg TV. The University of Michigan inflation expectations. Was this on your program this morning?
Yes, it was.
Okay, so 10 o'clock this morning, these numbers come across. And what was your immediate reaction? Because it's still hot.
Still high, but a little bit better than expected. But, the issue, I guess the expectations are, the longer term expectations still down around 3.3%, which seems pretty reasonable to me. 5.4% over the next year. High, but still pretty reasonable given what we know. But, when you're paying $5 a gallon at the pump, when you're trying to get a loaf of bread or a gallon of milk and you see the sticker shock there relative to 6 months ago, 9 months ago, it's hard for the average consumer to kind of see that or feel that maybe for some of the core areas we've peaked.
Okay, I want to put you on the spot here.
Yep.
When it comes to expectations versus actual inflation. Why are expectations so important for us to keep an eye on?
It's interesting. I think if you think the markets are a discounting mechanism for future earnings, future cash flows, you try to get a sense of what's my discount rate really need to be? Does it need to be we've had a very low discount rate for a long time.
It's funny, we talk about that in business school, but consumers don't necessarily think about the discount rate.
No, but they think about the cost of money and they think about the cash in their pocket. And those are all the things that they can feel, they can see here. And you look at the normalized rate. We had, again, Paul Krugman on. He was a very calm presence, I felt. He was like, things are okay. We'll be all right. We'll get out of it. I mean, that's the perspective of a long-term view of economic history, which I'm sure he knows as well or better than anybody. So, but it's just right at the moment for a lot of people, it feels very tough out there. And inflation is something we haven't had to talk about for a long time.
And look, and Krugman was, the first to say that he called it wrong, along with many others last year, who said that, inflation was indeed transitory when it actually wasn't.
Yeah.
You're listening to Bloomberg Business Week. Paul Sweeney and Tim Stenovec were live in the Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studios in New York. This is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, the Bloomberg Business app, and at Bloomberg Quick Take. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. Stocks continue to accelerate into the close. We've got the Dow up by 762 points right now, an advance of 2.5%. A rally in Treasuries waned after a reading on inflation expectations eased, and the Federal Reserve's Jim Bullard suggested recession fears are overdone. S&P best level up 104 right now, up by 2.75%. It is on track to have the best week in nearly a month. We've got NASDAQ up 313, higher by 2.8%. But the key takeaway, stocks rallying into the close. 10-year yield 3.13%. Spot gold, as I mentioned, up 0.1%, $18.25 the ounce. And crude catching a bit up 3%, $107.36 a barrel. Again, recapping, stocks are rallying. S&P up 103, up 2.7%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Thank you so much for that update, Charlie Pellet. It's 3:48 on Wall Street.
The following is an editorial from Bloomberg Opinion.
President Joe Biden and his allies in Congress are rightly concerned about surging prices. But the president's ideas for lowering inflation have been either beside the point or simply counterproductive. For example, he has again called for a brief gas tax holiday. The savings from this would be modest and at least partly self-defeating because it would increase gas demand, serving to push prices back up. There are better ways to fight inflation. For example, a moderate but broadly based effort to roll back so-called national security tariffs and other trade barriers could knock a percentage point off the inflation rate. While this wouldn't totally solve the problem of rising prices, it would at least reduce the pressure American consumers are feeling. And for Democrats nervously eyeing the midterm elections, it might even pay off politically. This editorial was written by the Bloomberg Opinion Editorial Board. I'm David Shipley. For more Bloomberg Opinion, please go to Bloomberg.com/opinion or OPI and Go on the Bloomberg Terminal.
This has been Bloomberg Opinion.
I'm driving in my car. I turn on the radio.
How about you let me drive?
Oh, no. Who's gonna drive you home? Honey, please, I'll do the driving. Drive on. Excuse me, I want to drive. It's the question that drives us.
This is the Drive to the Close.
That funky music will drive us till the dawn.
On Bloomberg Radio.
All right, I like nice round numbers as much as the next person. 3,900 for your S&P 500, up 2.8% today, as Charlie Pellet reported. This will be the first up week in about a month, over a month here. So I'm not sure what to make of that, but maybe our next guest who does this for a living, he might know. David Dietz, Managing Principal and Senior Portfolio Strategist at PPAC Private Wealth Management, joins us on the phone from the bustling metropolis of Summit, New Jersey. David, what do you make of this week's trading? What do you make of today's trading? A little bit of a dead cat bounce, or do we have the makings of something here?
Well, so that's the $64,000 question. Is this just an oversold bounce, or could it have some legs here? Certainly, there's a lot of positives. We started this year at about 22 times earnings. We came into this week at just 16 times earnings. And of course, you just look at the numbers, we're having one of the worst first halves of the year for stocks since about 1970. And quite frankly, when you look at history, bad first halves are typically followed by good second halves. The other thing I like here is we're detecting some softening in the economic conditions, which could help with the market's worst bugaboo. That would be inflation. So, for example, if you look at real estate, a lot of people are crying in their beer right now as layoffs are starting to mount, as those higher mortgage rates are starting to bite. And, of course, leading indicators like commodities are rolling back. So, for example, look at copper. Entered this week at a 16th-month low. Sometimes people call it copper Dr. Copper because of this uncanny ability to predict economic fortunes ahead. And so that suggests a weakening in the economy and some softening in inflation, and that ultimately could help the third bugaboo, which is what the Federal Reserve is going to do. And they're seeming to become increasingly sensitized to possible economic weakness, so perhaps higher interest rates won't continue forever.
Okay, so higher interest rates perhaps won't continue forever. And, I think we had a guest on last week. I forget who it was. I know Ari's going to say the name as soon as I say this, who said that the average amount of time between a tightening and a loosening schedule is only 8 months. So when the Fed stops tightening, on average, we start to see looser monetary policy, 8 months. I think it's still too early for us to talk about that. But I do wonder, David, how far you think the Fed will have to go in order to bring inflation under control. And then what will be the consequences of that?
Well, no one knows for sure, but remember, the bond market has done a lot of the work for the Federal Reserve already. We started the year with that 10-year at just 1.5%. It briefly got up to about 3.4%, more than a doubling. It's still well above 3%. And look at what corporations are using and relying on. For example, the most credit-challenged borrowers, the high-yield market, the yields there are now trading between 8 and 9%. And so that's got to slow the economy. We know it's slowing the real estate market. So between the bond market itself and, of course, a lot of jawboning, a lot of Sturm and Drang by the Federal Reserve, I think we've already started to slow the economy. So it could be a shorter period of time rather than a longer period of time for these rate hikes by the Fed.
So again, I think a lot of folks, look at this Federal Reserve and say, boy, they got a tough balancing act, trying to rein in inflation while not pushing the economy into a recession, or at least not a deep one. Do you think the Federal Reserve can, in fact, kind of thread that needle, if you will?
Well, they've admitted it's one of the toughest jobs on the planet here is to create that soft landing. And I think the problem is, of course, their key metrics that they're looking at to guide their policy is joblessness and inflation. And those are both lagging indicators, while monetary policy acts with anywhere from a 6 to 24-month lag, right? So they're trying to predict the weather when they land the plane based on the weather when the plane takes off. And so it's not easy. I guess the good news about that, although history doesn't favor them being able to create the soft landing, the good news is they're talking about how difficult it is. And so perhaps they're going to be a little bit more dovish, a little bit more cautious in terms of those rate hikes. And with some softening in the economic metrics that we saw, for example, even today with the Purchasing Managers Index softening a little bit, they may have less rate hikes, and that could help prevent a hard landing anyway.
What's the other data that we need to be looking at, or what are you looking at for indicators that we are starting to see some softening happening? And certainly, the inflation expectations from University of Michigan pulling back slightly from 14-year highs was welcome news to the market. But what else did we need to be looking at?
Well, next week, all eyes are going to be on Thursday's personal consumption expenditures inflation data. That's the Federal Reserve's preferred inflation gauge. And if that shows that inflation is continuing to worsen, I think we're going to see some volatility. If, on the other hand, we just see a little bit less inflation in the latest month versus the prior month, I think markets could cheer that news. And, of course, from a stock investor's point of view, all eyes are going to be on those earnings, those Q2 earnings. We're going to get them in waves starting in mid-July. We're going to see whether stock analysts have been too bullish and how those companies meet those expectations. And, of course, we're going to be listening carefully to the outlook. We know that things did cool off tremendously in Q2. How bad was that, and how is that going to affect what the Fed may do and what investors are going to do?
As a former equity analyst, I'm glad you brought up earnings. They do matter. They do count. And certainly in your initial thoughts on valuation here. One of the challenges, I think, and one of the concerns for analysts is, margins. To what extent are margins under pressure given some of these inflationary trends that we see out there? Is that kind of where you see the risk for earnings here? Not so much the top line, but maybe those profit margins?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you put it in context, which is basically macro analysts see higher earnings in the second half and higher earnings in 2023. And that doesn't square too well with just the overall recessionary concerns. But then you point to where could be the weak link, and that could easily be the margins, as you point out, because with these inflationary pressures pushing up the inputs for production and for services, and of course we know that wages are starting to go up. And so the question is, if companies are not able to increase prices and pass those along, then you're going to have that shrinking of the margins. We do know that margins are close to all-time highs when you look at history, so it wouldn't be surprising to see those diminishing a little bit. And, of course, that's going to weigh heavily on earnings.
David, we only have 30 seconds left here. The S&P 500 having its best day in more than a month since May 4th of 2022. Is the worst behind us?
for some sectors, possibly some of the tech names look pretty washed out here with the Nasdaq down 31%. What we're seeing from history is there's not one bottom, but there is a series of bottoms. So some things I would point out is, for example, some of the retailers have really been washed out here. You look at a company like Best Buy, 5% dividend, but they've increased that dividend 21% per year. Energy, of course, has pulled back dramatically, but they're expected to show some of the highest earnings growth going forward here.
All right, David Dietz, we love it when you join us, managing principal and senior portfolio strategist at PPAC Private Wealth Management. They've got $10.7 billion in assets under management. Joining us from beautiful Summit, New Jersey. Paul, we are just about 15 seconds away from joining our friends at Bloomberg TV for our countdown to the close. I do have to say that we are seeing the S&P 500 higher by more than 100 points right now, close to 3%. The Dow higher by 2.5%. This is Bloomberg.
Beyond the Bell, Bloomberg's comprehensive cross-platform coverage of the U.S. market close starts right now.
And we are 2 minutes away from the end of the trading day. Taylor Riggs, Katie Greifeld, Sonali Basak counting you down to the closing bell. Here to help us out, we're going beyond the bell in our global simulcast. We are joined by Tim Stenovic and Paul Sweeney, bringing together our Bloomberg television, radio, and YouTube audiences worldwide as we parse through the most crucial moments of the trading day. And Tim, you could argue it's a crucial moment of the trading day, definitely near the highs of the session.
Yeah, a nice little way to start the weekend off if you are indeed long these markets. Seeing the S&P 500 having its best day in more than a month since May 4th. We just spoke to David Dietz over at PPAC Private Wealth Management. I tried to get him to tell us whether or not the bottom was behind us. He wouldn't answer the question, but he did say that in history, there's not necessarily one bottom, there's a series of bottoms. So take that as you will.
Yeah, I'm looking at this market here. It's nice to see us closing out the day's trading, closing out the week, at or near high. So it's nice to see this market finishing out strong here with some conviction here. And it looks like some of those reopening trades, if you will, are kind of where the money's going.
I don't want to say dead cat bounce. I find it a repellent term, but
Is it because you love cats so much?
I do love cats. I do love cats. It's not the kind of imagery I want to put on this program, but it is a good question, Tim, to your point about where is the bottom, trying to find it. This could be just a bear market rally that many have been calling for.
Indeed, as we take a look at that, I know we have some rebalancing as well coming up. That's a conversation on TV we're going to have just after the closing bell as well. But we go cross asset as well as we always do. When you take a look at yields that are actually rising a little bit or so now, 3, 4, 5, even 6 basis points really here across the curve. But let's refocus here on these equity markets. Pretty interesting. You're now looking at a gain of about 2.7% on the Dow. I know that we hate to quote points, but when it's 830 points or so, it certainly catches our attention. An S&P that closes up more than 3%, and technology that's now up about 3.5% or so, Tim, on the NASDAQ and the NASDAQ 100. And when we zoom out to the Russell 2000, Tim, when we think about some of the small caps, some of the more domestically focused stocks, that as well also catching a bid.
All right, I'm just going to proactively say, feel for me when looking for decliners today because it is just a sea of green across the board right now. In the S&P 500, today, we saw 19 stocks close lower, 484 close higher. The Dow of the 30 stocks that make up the Dow, 28 finished higher, Sonali.
Yeah, it's so interesting. You take a look at the sectors here, Tim. Us TV people like what this looks like because media and entertainment stocks up more than 4.7%. Auto and component parts also up more than 4.5%. Consumer services, semis, insurance, materials. It's green on the screen everywhere you look today. It's a broad-based rally. Telecom services is the one thing that's a little bit red, guys, but it's a pretty green day.
And we really love that sort of deep dive sector look, as we always do. We also try to go cross asset here on this program as well. And I mentioned this a little bit. And I think what's so interesting, Tim, when we think about sort of the cross market trading here, when yields are rising, we've actually been in a trading range. I know we've talked about some of these intraday moves, but if we zoom out a little bit further, even on the 2s, even on the 10s, we really have been stuck in this 3.5 range here, and some of the flatness generally here of this yield curve. So, Tim, I do wonder, sort of long term, now that we're we're in maybe a little bit of a quiet period coming off sort of a big post-Federal Reserve decision of the last few weeks, how we sort of settle out here within the bond market as well.
Yeah, a really good question. I'm also looking to the equity market and companies that we start hearing from that are not just kicking off the new earnings season as we end the month here next week, but also what we have coming next week, specifically on Monday with a company like Nike, Shanali, because given the impact of COVID-19 lockdowns that have continued in China, it will be really interesting to hear from the company how it has affected sales there, and also just really get a read on the consumer and the health of the consumer, not just in China, but worldwide too, because it's pretty economically sensitive.
It's true. Remember, the last time around, a lot of investors got really caught off guard by those lockdowns in China. And now, if you look at it, investors really take that global view. On the consumer front, remember, the layoffs are starting, and they just started. So at what point does that start to bake into what consumers are actually putting to work, and how long does this last for?
I feel like earnings season never really ends, though.
It's
I mean,
true.
It's kicking off, but it's still going. But in any case, I mean, it is interesting when you think about the consumer, so resilient. That's been really a narrative going on throughout the pandemic and as we exit it. But that's not what the Fed wants necessarily. They're trying to cool down demand. I mean, the consumer, they want to see it crack at some point. Not there yet.
Big, strong finish for the S&P 500, up over 3%. There are a lot of gainers to choose from today, but I think the real story is it's kind of a reopening trade, and 15% moves in names like Royal Caribbean, some of the gaming stocks like Penn and Caesars, and even the airlines, even though they're canceling flights. People are trying to get places and do things, and that's kind of what we're seeing in some of those reopening names here on the S&P 500.
Yeah, well, not the same story for the decliners. We only saw 19 stocks move lower on the S&P 500. It's interesting, Paul. We saw stable names underperforming today as people moved into those riskier reopening assets like cruises. Healthcare and telecom moved lower. Look at this. Verizon finishing the day down by 2%. We had United Healthcare Group finishing the day down by 0.8%. Still, though, United Health shares up about 10% over just the last 4 days. Here's one that's actually moving for a reason. LendingTree, down close to 8% today. The company reported results for its most recent quarter after the markets closed yesterday. Shares fell after the company said it cut its second quarter forecast, both for revenue and adjusted EBITDA.
And as we think sort of big picture, Tim, I think sort of all the big conversations outside, sort of the Federal Reserve has been further comments that we've gotten from that decision. I believe it was on maybe June 15th or so. You take a look at what Bullard had to say today when he says that similar comments, maybe recession isn't inevitable, that maybe we might not be there. And I thought that was interesting, as we've talked a lot about on this program, some of the recession, not concerns, but maybe the discussion about them. And I'd bring up Romaine, Katie, when he says if we keep talking about it, then yeah, we may get one.
Speak it into existence. It's a real thing because expectations, they shape reality. But in any case, we had those comments, but you also have comments too that we're already in the recession. Obviously, we're not going to know until after the fact, but whether or not it happens, obviously the depth of it matters when you start to think about corporations, when you start to think about the default rate among those corporations. It all sort of hinges on how deep that recession is.
I just want to jump in here because it makes me think of Steve Matthews' conversation that he had with us earlier this week. He reports on the economy out of our Atlanta bureau, and he said when you're seeing every single month 400 to 500,000 jobs created, it's really hard to imagine a situation where we are currently in a recession because those employment gains are so robust, Shanali.
Well, if we're not in a recession, it's a good news for the market because the big worry, as you all know, is the fact that the Fed won't be able to step in this time around the way they did in the last two recessions. So that fear still sticks around, especially in regard to all of, as we keep talking about it, those companies that are burdened with debt, limping along, facing higher interest rates. It will still be tough, guys.
Yeah, exactly right. And as you think about the stock market, just specifically discounting future cash flows here, and to the extent that interest rates aren't going to be rising, maybe as much as people had initially thought, as recently as maybe a week or two ago, that might explain some of the movement we're seeing here, the positive movement this week.
Paul, I want to come back to you on that because it was interesting. We were speaking with Ann Maletti, at least on the TV side over at Allspring, and she said, we're in a different era. The narrative has changed. Higher cash, the higher discount rate that you mentioned is here to stay. What do you make of that, sort of the total valuation around these valuations in the face of yields that you're getting at least 3% now?
It's a lot different than the days when you're getting, close to 0% here. So there is an argument maybe for fixed income in your portfolio. So that kind of goes to some of the more cyclical names that are performing a little bit better so far in this move up, which raises the question, what happened to the Amazons and the Apples that were the core of everybody's portfolio for more than a decade, the Microsofts? We'll see how this rotation plays out.
Yeah, we'll certainly have to wait and see about that. And look, we're going to start to get some results from those companies in the coming weeks as they close the books on this most recent quarter. Yesterday, we had a guest on the program who talked to us about the surveys they had been doing with 80 to 100 institutional investors and just the change in sentiment that they've been hearing from those institutional investors. And I wonder to what extent we'll start to see that change in sentiment reflected in the numbers, and when we'll start to see those companies actually say, wait a second, we are starting to see a softening in demand from consumers, and that's going to be reflected not just on our top line, but our bottom line as well.
I was actually in that conversation.
Oh yeah, you were there, Katie.
I've been bouncing around back and forth, but it is interesting to sort of read the tea leaves from the corporations, from the C-suite. The tone has been pretty dire, but you're not necessarily seeing that yet reflected in what analysts are expecting in terms of earnings estimates and expectations. Will be interesting to see when those numbers start to come down.
Yeah, shocker, disconnect between Wall Street analysts and the corporations. But we will get a lot of commentary moving ahead, especially as things start to shake out in the next couple of weeks with those earnings that are expected to be lower.
Well, happy Friday, everyone. We hope you have a great weekend. A big thank you to our TV team and our radio teams, of course, for our cross-platform coverage of the market close here on Bloomberg TV, on Bloomberg Radio, and on YouTube. We are going to be back at the same time, same place on Monday. Have a great weekend, everyone.
You're listening to Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Bloomberg Quick Takes Tim Stenovic on Bloomberg Radio.
It's Bloomberg Business Week. Paul Sweeney and Tim Stenovic were live in the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. So, Paul, that's it. Markets are closed. We're done.
Yeah, markets are closed. And again, I'm looking at the cruise ships. People, those cruisers, they are a loyal bunch out there. And I think, the stock market likes the cruise names as a solid reopening trade. Royal Cruise Line's up 15.8% today. Big move.
Charlie Pellet loves to go on cruises.
I know. He's an evangelist for the cruising.
He is. He hasn't. I don't think he's gone on one. I think he told us yesterday he hasn't gone on one since the pandemic, but he's getting ready to book his next one.
Good.
But look at that. The moves in that reopening are huge.
Yeah, they really are. And just kind of goes to the issue of, what is your economic call for the next 6, 12, 18 months? And to the extent it's anything constructive, you can see how investors are willing to get back into those, names that are really leveraged to a reopening.
All right, well, we got much more programming coming up over the next hour, so you're going to want to keep it locked in here to Bloomberg Business Week. Let's get down to Washington, D.C. now for a check of the latest world and national news with Nancy Lyons. Hey, Nance.
Thank you, Tim. The Supreme Court has ended constitutional protections for abortion that had been in place nearly 50 years. It was a decision by its conservative majority to overturn the court's landmark abortion cases. President Biden calls it a sad day.
The conservative majority of the Supreme Court shows how extreme it is, how far removed they are from the majority of this country. They've made the United States an outlier among developed nations in the world. But this decision must not be the final word.
Biden says it'll now be up to voters to elect leaders who will share their views so that Congress can enshrine abortion rights as the law of the land. House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy is applauding today's news.
This great nation can now live up to its core principle that all are created equal, not born equal, created equal. Americans celebrate this historic victory because we know it will save the lives of millions of children and it will give families hope.
McCarthy says today's decision shows the Supreme Court will not be bullied. A bipartisan gun violence bill is headed to President Biden's desk after final passage by the House. Speaker Nancy Pelosi announcing the votes.
On this vote, the yeas are 234. The nays are 193. The motion is adopted.
It is the most significant firearms bill to come out of Congress in nearly 30 years. It boosts funding for school security and mental health services and expands background checks for gun buyers under the age of 21. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries.
All right, Nancy, thank you so much. We appreciate that. All right, Tim, one of my favorite sporting events of the year is Wimbledon. I just love it. I always had the opportunity to go there several years ago. It was just a bucket list type thing, really cool.
Did you have to dress up?
I dressed appropriately.
You gotta wear the whites if you're on the court at Wimbledon.
Right.
But you gotta look the part.
Oh, yeah, and people do look the part big time. It's not quite the Kentucky Derby, but it's pretty stylish. You know what? The woman who won it last year, Australian Ashley Barty, at 25 years old, she retired. She's not going to be defending her title, which I found that just fascinating that at 25 years old, okay, she's won $24 million. That's a lot of dough. But she just retired. She's kind of had enough.
Ready to do something else.
Yeah, she actually is a fantastic athlete. Back in Australia, she played professional cricket for a little bit, and apparently she's really good at that as well. Like, now she's just trying to improve her golf game. And some pros are telling her, hey, you keep working at it, you might be able to turn pro.
So do we know why she retired?
It's what you hear from a lot of professional athletes, but particularly tennis players, and it just burned out kind of thing. I've had enough. I've been, I devoted most of my life to this. It's a solitary existence. And you travel all over the world. I'm sure the last few years of the pandemic travel haven't been helpful, but it's rare to see somebody, particularly given the money that's out there now, which is just going up and up and up.
And oftentimes you do see some of these athletes, especially with tennis, peak at such a young age.
Yes.
But there are some outliers, like the Williamses, who stuck around for a really long time.
Serena, at the age of 40, is coming back to Wimbledon, which is just awesome. I don't know, what her game looks like, but just to have her back is fantastic. So,
I can relate, Paul. I played Division III tennis 3 years at Colby College in Waterville, Maine.
Nice.
I ended up not playing my senior year because I was getting injured so much.
Right.
That I was spending so much time. And this is D3 we're talking about,
Did you ever
right?
play an outdoor match?
Oh, yeah, we did. Yeah.
In the snow?
Not many. No, in the spring and in the fall. But in Hilton Head, South Carolina, where we went to spring break, all right? You're listening to Bloomberg Business Week, and this is Bloomberg Radio.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, the Bloomberg Business app, and at Bloomberg Quick Take. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. The International Monetary Fund says the U.S. economy is likely to slow in 2022 and 2023, but will narrowly avoid a recession as the Federal Reserve implements its rate tightening plan to curb inflation. Stocks came roaring back for the week. The S&P was up 6.45% this week. NASDAQ up 7.5% this week. Today, stocks rallied with the S&P 500 index advancing 116 points, buying into the close, higher today by 3.1%. The Dow was up 823 points, up 2.7%. NASDAQ up 375, up by 3.3%. 10-year down 12.30 seconds. 10-year yield 3.13%. Spot gold up 0.2%, $18.25 the ounce. And West Texas Intermediate crude today up 3.2%, $107.61 a barrel. So again, worth repeating, S&P up more than 3% today, the most since May of 2020. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Well, the KPMG Women's PGA Championship, it's underway this week at Congressional Country Club, which is awesome, by the way, Bethesda, Maryland.
You played it?
I have played it once, yeah.
Nice.
Just awesome, way back in the day. Very tough, man. Jill Spiegel's with us. She's the Chief Merchandising Officer for the PGA Tour Superstore, joining us on the phone from Atlanta. Jill, an exciting time to be in the game of golf. We've got lots of news out there on both the men's and the women's tour. But since we have the Women's PGA Championship here, I'd love to get your sense of just the overall health of the game of golf on the LPGA Tour.
Yeah, well, I was actually in Bethesda earlier in the week, and really, really exciting and a lot of positive momentum. You know, as you know, they announced on Tuesday that the purse has doubled from $4.5 to $9 million for this week's tournament, which was similar to what the LPGA did during the Women's U.S. Open. It doubled, went from $5.5 to $10 million. You know, the ladies are playing at more prestigious golf courses. You know, at Congressional, one of the most prestigious in the world. You know, recently renovated and has hosted 5 men's majors. There's going to be national coverage this weekend, which isn't typical, both on NBC, both Saturday and Sunday. And what's really cool about this week's event is also the 50-year anniversary of Title IX, you know, giving women an equal playing field. And, you know, women now make up 44% of college athletes, and it was just 15% before Title IX. So, you know, not only does women's golf have a lot of momentum right now, it's been a banner year for women's sports in general. You know, the recent announcement of the U.S. women's national soccer team reaching a settlement for equal pay. We're seeing women's coaches in men's professional sports, and women in C-suite positions in men's professional sports. So really just all in all, a lot of positive momentum.
How's the pipeline right now into the LPGA? And how do you continue to strengthen that pipeline and attract new golfers?
Well, there's a lot of excitement and there's a lot of women, and I think the LPGA is working hard to make this attractive for women. And
golf is tough, Jill, because it typically requires significant money in order to be able to play when you're a young person. If you don't live near a country club or live near a public course, perhaps, or you're not a member of a country club, you have to go to a public course. And there's a lot of commitment and time commitment that goes into it. So how do you level the playing field there and get more people involved from all parts of the economic strata?
Right, and that's a really good question, and I think that's where organizations are working to do that and equal the playing field. There's a lot of disparity now between the LPGA and the PGA Tour, and there's a lot more opportunity for men versus women. So to see these changes, and the size of the purses increase is just making it that more attractive. And and you're right, but it's getting in from the ground floor and providing opportunities for these young girls, so they have the same opportunities as their male counterparts.
We think about the game of golf, and it truly is a global game. And for the women's tour, so much of their players and so much of the new players coming from Asia. Talk to us about kind of the LPGA or strategy in terms of kind of taking advantage of that, because it seems to be a big source of growth for the game.
It is a big source of growth, and you do have, you have a lot of international players. You have players from all the countries. You have a lot of American players as well. And when you look at the leaderboard today, it's all over the place. And you have right now I think 4 or 5 players in the top U.S. players in the top 10. Including Korean and Japanese and Canadian, and
right.
It's really all over.
Hey, Jill, since you handle merchandising, Chief Merchandising Officer at the PGA Tour Superstore, eager to hear from you about what you're seeing in terms of sales, consumer demand right now, because, we are talking a lot about the macroeconomic headwinds, higher inflation. Are you seeing any sort of softness with people purchasing?
Yeah, well, you're right. There are a lot of headwinds, and we're all dealing with that. However, people want to maintain a healthy lifestyle right now. They want to be out. There's been a lot of new golfers that have come into the game the last couple of years, with COVID and people having more flexibility in their work schedules. And people want to be outside, spending time with, family and friends playing golf. And the game of golf is shifting for the better, and, we continue to reap the benefits. Last week, was Father's Day, obviously, and our biggest week of the year, biggest week in our company's history. It's Christmas for us. It's our Super Bowl. And if you look at our business compared to 19, we're up over 90%. The industry is healthy as well, up over 30%. And even going into 2022, we're still seeing growth. We're seeing growth on a comp store basis, and we're also seeing growth overall because we continue to open stores. And, we're gaining share across all product categories, and there's just a lot of interest in golf right now. There were 530 million rounds played last year, which was the highest ever recorded and a 20% increase compared to 19. And, we're really helping to fuel that growth. We've opened 10 stores since 19, 3 so far this year, 5 more coming this year. So we'll have close to 50 stores by the end of the year. And we're going into a lot of new markets, Tampa, Philly, Charlotte, Bethesda, 3 more in California, a store in Milwaukee. So we're really filling in across the country. So even though there are headwinds and economic challenges, golf feels somewhat insulated at the moment, and we're continuing to be aggressive and to open stores and take advantage of this momentum.
And a lot of people took it up during COVID because it was one of those things you could do outside and you weren't touching each other. Jill Spiegel, Chief Merchandising Officer at PGA Tour Superstore, joining us this afternoon on the phone. I remember talking to a friend in like April of 2020 when everyone was freaked out about COVID. He lived in Florida, and he was like, I just played a round of golf. It was great.
Yep. Socially distant, no problem.
Exactly. You're listening to Bloomberg Business Week. Paul Sweeney and Tim Stenevik in the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio on this Friday afternoon. This is Bloomberg.
Broadcasting live from the Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio in New York. Bloomberg 1130. To Washington, D.C., Bloomberg 99.1. To Boston, Bloomberg 106.1. To San Francisco, Bloomberg 960. To the country, Sirius XM Channel 119. And around the globe, the Bloomberg Business app and BloombergRadio.com. This is Bloomberg Business Week.
It's Bloomberg Business Week. Tim Stenevec and Paul Sweeney. We're live in the Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio in New York. In just a few minutes, we're going to continue our coverage of the Supreme Court decision overturning Roe v. Wade. We're going to check in with the editor of the National Review, also a Bloomberg opinion columnist, joining us to talk about what this means for conservatives right after this, because we got Charlie Pellet, all the action you're covering in the after hours after today's rally.
Indeed, what a week it was for the S&P, up by 6.45% on the week, Tim. The Dow this week up by 5.4%, but the outperformer this week, the NASDAQ Composite Index, advancing by 7.5%. We saw buying right into the close today as stocks rebounded from a rout that drove the market down for 3 straight weeks. David Dietz is managing principal and senior portfolio strategist at PPAC Private Wealth Management, and he was our guest right here on Bloomberg Business Week.
Certainly, there's a lot of positives. We started this year at about 22 times earnings. We came into this week at just 16 times earnings. And of course, you just look at the numbers, we're having one of the worst first halves of the year for stocks since about 1970. And quite frankly, when you look at history, bad first halves are typically followed by good second halves.
S&P 500 gained more than 3% today for its biggest advance since May of 2020. S&P up 116 points. The Dow advanced 823 points, up 2.7%. NASDAQ up 375, a gain of 3.3%. 10-year yield 3.13%. Spot gold up 0.2%. 18.26 the ounce. West Texas Intermediate crude up 3.1%. 107.54 a barrel. Bitcoin up almost 2% now to 21,202. Bank stocks rallied. All major banks passed a stress test by the Fed, showing they could withstand a severe recession. Today we saw J.P. Morgan Chase up by 3%, Citigroup up 3.3%, Wells Fargo up 7.6%, Bank of America up by 0.7%. And that's a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Thank you so much for that update, Charlie Pellet. Well, we're continuing our coverage of the Supreme Court overturning Roe v. Wade in a 6-3 decision, wiping out the constitutional right to abortion. The court voting along ideological lines. Because of trigger laws, we're already seeing abortion made illegal in several states around the country. Joining us this afternoon is Ramesh Ponnuru, the editor of the National Review, also an opinion columnist for Bloomberg Opinion. Ramesh joining us on the phone from Washington, D.C. Ramesh, we knew this was coming because of the leak last month. Still, though, eager to hear your reaction when you saw this just after 10 Wall Street time.
It was a little surprising. I had by now started to think that it would be the last day of the Supreme Court's term that they release this. And as somebody who has been advocating for an end to Roe v. Wade for a very long time on the ground that it is very bad constitutional law, that it's not really based in anything ratified in the Constitution, I was just extremely pleased. I was really happy to see so much work, so many votes, so much prayer paying off, but I also recognize that a lot of my fellow Americans feel deeply on the other side, and that there's going to be a lot of work to do to build a consensus in our country in favor of life.
So, Ramesh, I guess the other side that we've heard probably pretty clearly today is kind of the view of, how do you view this Constitution? Is it something that is rigid, or is it something perhaps that evolves over time and maybe reflects changes in society? How do you think about that? And do you think that was key to what the Supreme Court, to their ruling?
Well, the Constitution has some looseness in it. It's flexible to the extent that it can be applied to new circumstances. So freedom of speech doesn't just refer to quill pens. That kind of updating has to take place all the time. When you have more substantive updating, where it's not just a new application but a new meaning, the way you make that change is through the amendment process to the Constitution. That's part of the genius of the Constitution. It includes within it a process for amendments, and that's how we got such things as universal women's suffrage, and the end of slavery in the 13th Amendment was through a constitutional amendment. So the Constitution can change, but when it's a question of its actual meaning, I don't think that the change should come just from the bench. It should come through an actual amendment that the people vote on.
A lot of places I want to go with you, Ramesh. I'm trying to decide where. Let's talk about yesterday's decision about the Second Amendment. And I'm just having trouble seeing, the differences here, and because there are some stark differences. So on the one hand, states have control over what they say about abortion, but on the other hand, they don't when it comes to guns. Help me make sense of that.
Sure, that's a good point, and it is a point that has occurred to a lot of people. And I think the difference here is that the Constitution explicitly marks out a right to keep and bear arms. Now, we can debate, of course, what that means in practice, whether the court got it right yesterday in its ruling, but you've got this explicit mention in the text of the Constitution of the right to bear arms, and there's just nothing comparable when it comes to abortion. And that, I think, accounts for the basic difference. It's not surprising that the state should have more ability to regulate abortion without any sort of judicial superintendence of that than of guns.
Well, let's jump back to today's ruling, because a lot of people are concerned, hearing from Justice Clarence Thomas in a concurring opinion, that other rights based on due process need to be reassessed in future cases, specifically Griswold, Lawrence, and Obergefell, the right for same-sex marriage. What would you say to people listening right now that say, wait a second, we could lose the right to same-sex marriage in this country?
So, of course, the 6 votes in the majority, including Justice Thomas, say that this particular opinion, today's opinion on abortion, does not undermine those other cases. Now, you could in the future have challenges. Let's say you had a state that decided it wanted to ban contraception. It's hard to see that. That's a pretty remote prospect, but if a state did that, and then that made its way up through the courts to the Supreme Court, which is, again, another pretty unlikely prospect, then the court would have to go back and look at its analysis of precedent, all the factors that it uses to decide which precedents have to stay and which precedents have to go. And the key difference is that through this entire period, even in Roe v. Wade itself, the Supreme Court said the government has an interest in protecting life, or even early in pregnancy. And Justice Alito, in today's opinion on Dobbs, says that's the fundamental difference between the abortion case and the contraception, same-sex marriage, and these other cases.
Ramesh Ponnuru, we are unfortunately out of time. We've got to have you back. Editor of the National Review, also a columnist for Bloomberg Opinion, joining us from Washington, D.C. Let's stay in Washington, D.C. and go to Nancy Lyons for an update on world and national news. Hey, Nance.
Thanks, Tim. President Biden says today's Supreme Court ruling overturning Roe v. Wade on abortion means it'll now be up to voters to elect leaders to Congress who will vote to legislate abortion rights into federal law.
This is a sad day for the country, in my view. But it doesn't mean the fight's over. Let me be very clear and unambiguous. The only way we can secure a woman's right to choose, the balance that existed, is for Congress to restore the protections of Roe v. Wade as federal law.
Biden says he'll make sure the Justice Department allows women who live where abortion is outlawed will be able to freely travel to states where it's legal. Kelly Robinson is executive director of the Planned Parenthood Action Fund.
The impact is going to be immediate. There are 13 states that will ban abortion immediately, and 26 states over the course of the next couple of months will ban access to abortion care. That's hundreds of thousands of people that will be impacted each year.
Robinson says the majority of the country is against banning abortion. The nation's largest nurses union, National Nurses United, says abortions will not stop, but they will be less safe. Carol Tobias is the president of the National Right to Life.
The Supreme Court has correctly decided the right to kill unborn children is not in the U.S. Constitution. So this is just a great day for mothers and their babies.
Carol Tobias criticized Democrats for moving to reverse today's ruling, saying they would prefer no limits on abortion. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Nancy Lyons.
Thank you so much for that update, Nancy Lyons, Tim Stenivek, and Paul Sweeney. We're live in the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. Paul, I've been thinking a lot about the housing market around the country because we're in a bit of a crisis right now. I can't even say we're in a bit of a crisis. We are in a crisis when it comes to affordability. At the same time, we're seeing rents continue to go up, salaries not match them, and I'm wondering what that means for how much the consumer is going to be able to spend on housing if they're spending so much on other things.
It's supposed to be 30% of your gross monthly income is kind of, if you Google it,
Is that what the mortgage brokers tell us, right?
Yeah, you know, I'm
it's
just trying
funny
to
when you call a mortgage broker, they think you can, afford an expensive home.
Right,
Because they're like,
exactly.
oh, well, you don't have any childcare costs, right?
You know what I've come to learn over the recent years is this has become more and more of an issue, i.e. housing or the lack thereof, is just the home builders, you think about it, their incentive is to build a big McMansion because that's where the margin is, as opposed to the entry-level home. So a lot of housing experts tell me the housing stock for entry level, that's really where the challenge is, and they're just not building. But that is changing a little bit. I think in the last few years, from what I've heard, as it's been this big exodus from the cities to the burbs. So maybe that's changing a little bit.
But I wonder, though, about prices because we have this double whammy. You know, we have this idea of we've underbuilt over the last decade since the housing crisis, since the great financial crisis. So we have that. Now we have mortgage rates higher than 6% right now, the highest they've been in years. So at the same time, we have housing prices not necessarily falling to the extent that we would think they would, although we are starting to see demand soften. In parts of the Mountain West, for example, we're starting to see that demand soften, but it's not yet hitting the entire country.
I wonder, just story after story after story of companies and people moving to Austin, Texas, down to Miami. I mean, where are they putting all these people? It's just amazing.
It's a great question.
And I know that Citadel, they're moving their headquarters down there. They're actually going to build their headquarters because there's just, there's not a lot of grade A space down there for some of these firms. So it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out over time.
All right, we're going to continue talking this on the other side. You're listening to Bloomberg Business Week. Tim Stenivek and Paul Sweeney, and this is Bloomberg Radio.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, the Bloomberg Business app, and at Bloomberg Quick Take. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. Big rally this week on Wall Street with the S&P up 6.45%, wiping out losses from the past 2 weeks as recession fears calmed and key economic data suggested inflation may be cooling. All 11 major industry groups rose today. The S&P was up 116 points, gaining into the close, up 3.1%. The Dow rallied 823 points, up 2.7%. The Nasdaq Composite Index was up 375, up 3.3%. 10-year was down 12.30 seconds. The 10-year yield, 3.13%. Spot gold up $4 the ounce to $18.26, up 0.2%. Bitcoin today was up 1.75%. Bitcoin is now at 21,160. West Texas Intermediate crude oil up 3%, 107.42 a barrel. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Thank you so much for that update, Charlie Pellet. Well, our next guest was a marketing executive at Procter & Gamble for 17 years. Before that, she was a platoon commander in the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces. Now she's an adjunct professor of the science of happiness at the Singapore Management University and the author of a new book. It's called Dare to Lead Like a Girl, How to Survive and Thrive in the Corporate Jungle. Very pleased to have joined us Dahlia Feldheim, a consultant and author, and the author of this new book. She joins us via Zoom from Israel, where it's very late at night. Dahlia, thanks for staying up late and joining us. How are you?
Thank you. Lovely being here.
What does it mean to lead like a girl?
To lead like a girl is to connect to what was considered more feminine leadership traits. It basically means leading from the heart. So we have, within us, it's not about women versus men, okay? We all have within us both masculine and feminine leadership traits. But the business world today has crashed a little bit into the wounded masculine, where power over people versus power with people. So leading like a girl is tilting it back and helping all men and women connect to those more feminine soft skills, things like passion, perseverance, people, and positivity.
So how did the past 2.5 years of this pandemic, how did that impact women's ability to maintain leadership positions? My senses would make it even tougher. I'm just not sure. How do you feel?
Yeah, it's there's two sides to it, actually. On the one side, we have seen that, countries dealing better with COVID, 5 out of 7 were led by women. So there was something really interested in the way women led those markets, with empathy, speaking to the children, addressing fear, etc., that actually brought out the importance of these, feminine leadership traits, or I'll call them feminine. It's really not. It's the soft skills and the importance of them, of dealing with today's world. From the flip side, so that's kind of a good thing and a good progress. Today, when we're working remotely, the command and control type of leadership is not relevant anymore, right? You can't lead people remotely when you don't have empathy. You can't innovate when you don't have empathy and you don't understand, unmet consumers' needs. So that's on the positive side. On the negative side, sadly, we do see women, taking the heavy loads in managing homeschooling and working, school kids studying from school and, being set back. So that was a huge setback for women advancement. But I'm hoping as the markets kind of open up again, and as many men, I think that another good thing is many men actually saw what their wives have to do, in kind of the balancing act. I saw a lot of great posts on that being run. So I hope as the market open, we actually realize that if we want to succeed in the world, it takes two to tango, right? We all need to be in it. And in this new world where we're hybrids most of the time and remote, if we don't lead with empathy and kindness and intuition, we won't be leading. We're seeing it. Number one, the Great Resignation, right? You all know what it is. 40% claim to leave. In the next year, 24 million Americans already left. And recent research was actually done to try and understand the reason for the Great Resignation. And they found it's not pay or burnout. The number one is toxic environments.
Right.
So we're seeing, there was an urgent need before COVID. Okay, we know even from 2018 Gallup, 85% of employees are unhappy in the workplace, believe they work for companies that don't, think of them as human being or accept them as human being. Even worse, 20% or so unhappy, they're determined to make others unhappy, right? They're the toxic employees. So we saw it before COVID, and we're seeing it much stronger with COVID. So I think all these dimensions, on the one hand, employees are fed up, okay? And they're deciding with their feet.
Right.
On the flip side, all the challenges and the new work environment, the future of work. I think, I wrote this book in end of 2018, beginning of 2019, before COVID, and I gave my TED talk before COVID. But I think in all summing all everything up, I think actually COVID made this an even more urgent and important. We're in the midst of a major mental health crisis, and we know what can help. We know how to build empathy. It's actually, we can teach ourselves to be more empathetic and lead more like a girl.
Hey, Dalia, I want to hit a redhead here on the Bloomberg terminal. Some breaking news, excuse me. We're learning from Dow Jones that Chevron is going to sell its California headquarters and pay staff to relocate to Texas. This is a big deal, Paul Sweeney. We were talking earlier about companies moving from Illinois to Florida and to Texas as well.
Yeah, very interesting. So, again, a major California corporation moving to Texas. We've seen that story before. Dalia, you're joining us via Zoom from Israel. I'd love to get a sense, what is life like in Israel today, kind of on this tail end of the pandemic? How do you feel like Israel's done? The Israeli people have adapted? Do they feel like the worst is behind us, or is there life back in the cities?
I spent most of the pandemic in Singapore.
Right.
Okay. And Singapore was tough, right? Because rules were stringent. You could meet 2 people a day. It was very challenging. And then I moved to Israel, and there's oh my God, complete difference. People are not as disciplined. And I asked yourself, I thought when I was in Singapore, that's the right way. Everyone's disciplined, but you really saw that, it's not something that can be overcome. We sometimes try to kind of fight. It's a virus, and we need to take precautions. But I think in retro, looking forward, it was actually really interesting to see the Israeli approach to it, where life kind of stopped for a while. Schooling, I think on the negative side, schooling was stopped, whereas in Singapore, they really kind of kept going the whole time. But I think life is back to its crazy, buzzing self. And I'm asking myself, chapter 15 in the book is all about post-traumatic growth. Post-traumatic growth is when we not only, show resilience, so we come back to where we were before, but we actually leverage the challenges that we had to end up in a better place. And I hope and pray that actually this crisis, and we know crisis, even the Hebrew, okay, and not many people know it. Many people know the Chinese, that crisis is also an inflection point. But I'll tell you another thing that not many know, that crisis in Hebrew, the word mashber, is actually the last stage before birth, okay? So even in ancient Hebrew, the crisis word is an opportunity for growth. So I'm really hoping that we don't go back to our buzzing, crazy self. I see more people locating less busy places.
Dalia,
I myself live in,
we unfortunately have to leave it there. We are running out of time, but we really appreciate you taking the time and joining us this evening from Israel. Dalia Feldheim is a consultant and an author. She spent 17 years at Procter & Gamble. She began her career in the IDF. She's author of the new book, Dare to Lead Like a Girl, How to Survive and Thrive in the Corporate Jungle. I spent some time in Israel.
Yep.
A friend of mine did the IDF.
Sure.
It's intense. He was there for 2.5 years doing this.
Those people, they are serious. They know what they're doing over there.
On behalf of the entire team here at Bloomberg Business Week, a big thank you and have a great weekend, everyone.